I should have known something was wrong. It wasn't one big moment, but 1,000 small things that chipped away at the edges of what I thought was a normal life. My name is Jack, and I used to think I had everything figured out. I had a wife, Melanie, 2 kids, Cameron, who was 15 at the time, and Emma, who was 12, and a successful construction business I'd built from scratch. Life seemed simple, predictable, the kind of life everyone dreams of having. But then came the cracks. I'll never forget the first time I truly realized something was off. I had returned early from a work meeting one afternoon. I had forgotten a set of blueprints, and as I came through the door, I heard them, the voices. They weren't loud, but they were sharp, urgent. Melanie was talking to someone in the kitchen, and the tone of her voice stopped me dead in my tracks. "Make sure they believe it," I heard her say. "We can't let Jack know what we're really doing." Not yet. I froze, standing just outside the kitchen doorway, listening as my heart began to race. I didn't know who she was talking to, but the words felt wrong, like a knife twisting in my gut. "Don't worry," a man's voice responded. "We've been laying the groundwork for months. By the time we're done, he'll have no idea what hit him." I barely registered the rest of the conversation, my mind scrambling to process what I had just overheard. But that one sentence, "By the time we're done, he'll have no idea what hit him," was enough to set off a cold dread in my chest. I knew it wasn't good. I didn't know exactly what was happening, but I knew it involved me. I stepped back out of sight, my mind racing. I didn't want to confront her then, not with only fragments of the conversation. I needed more information. But something told me I'd just uncovered the beginning of something much darker than I was prepared for. The next few weeks were a blur of confusion. I watched Melanie like a hawk, trying to piece together what she and whoever that man was were planning. I didn't confront her immediately. I didn't even know where to begin. Everything still looked the same. Our house, the kids, the routines. But beneath the surface, I could feel the shift, the subtle changes that made my gut twist tighter. She'd become distant, distracted. Little things started slipping through the cracks, miscommunications, odd phone calls, the way she would avoid eye contact when I asked simple questions. I wasn't a fool. I knew something was wrong, but I couldn't pinpoint what it was. And then, it happened. Cameron came to me one night after dinner. He was sitting on the couch, staring down at his phone like he was lost in thought. I had just finished cleaning up the dishes when he spoke. "Dad, there's something you need to know," he said, his voice quiet. I could hear the nervousness in it, the hesitation. "What's going on, Cam?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. "I didn't want to tell you before," he said, his eyes avoiding mine. "But now, I think you need to know. I heard Mom and Rick talking last night. And Dad, they were planning something. Something about you." My chest tightened. I felt that familiar, icy feeling again, like I was standing at the edge of a cliff and I didn't know if I could take a step back. "Wait. Rick," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "What were they saying?" "They were talking about making you look bad," Cameron said, his voice cracking. "About getting you into trouble. They said they could ruin you." I stared at him for a moment, trying to process the words. Rick. Melanie and Rick. My best friend for years. The one person I thought I could trust. "I don't get it, Cam," I said, feeling a knot tighten in my throat. "What were they planning exactly?" "Mom said she could get you in trouble. She said you were abusive, and if she could make you look bad enough, she could take everything from you. And Rick was helping her." I sank down into the chair across from him. It was like the ground had shifted under my feet. The woman I had loved, the mother of my kids, the woman I had built my life with was plotting against me. And Rick, the man I had trusted for years, was in on it. They were working together to destroy me, to destroy our family. Cam, are you sure about this? I asked, my voice tight. I didn't want to believe it, Cameron said, but I overheard them talking about it. They were planning to accuse you of stuff that isn't true, stuff that would make everyone think you were the problem. The world around me seemed to spin. I was a man who had built his life on hard work and honesty. I had never cheated, never lied, and I had done everything I could to make sure my kids had a stable home. And now this. Now Melanie, my wife, the woman I trusted more than anyone, was willing to destroy me? For what? Power? Money? I had no idea, but I knew I couldn't let this stand. I wanted to believe this was some kind of misunderstanding, that Cameron had misheard something, that maybe Rick and Melanie had just been talking nonsense. But deep down, I knew better. This wasn't just talk. They were planning something, and I needed to find out what it was before it was too late. Cam, I need you to stay calm, I said, forcing myself to sound more composed than I felt. I don't want you to get involved in this, but I need you to keep your ears open. If you hear anything else, anything at all, come and tell me. You understand? He nodded, though I could see the fear in his eyes. I will, Dad. I just didn't want you to get hurt. I'll make sure that doesn't happen, I promised. But deep inside, I wasn't sure how I could protect him, or Emma, or myself, if I didn't know exactly what Melanie and Rick were up to. The next few days were filled with questions. What were they planning? How far would they go? What was the ultimate goal? And more importantly, what did I do now? The truth, however, was that I didn't know what to do next. But I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't just sit back and wait for them to tear my family apart. If I was going to fix this, I had to fight back. And so I started making plans of my own. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was living in a foreign world. Every conversation, every gesture, every glance from Melanie started to feel like a coded message, a puzzle I couldn't solve. But I was determined to figure it out, no matter what it took. I started keeping a closer eye on her, tracking her movements without her knowing. I knew it was wrong, that I shouldn't be spying on my wife. But what choice did I have? Cameron's words, the fear in his voice, the certainty with which he told me that Melanie and Rick were planning something, those thoughts wouldn't leave my mind. I had always trusted Melanie completely, even when we first met in our early 20s. She had been sweet, intelligent, and kind, a woman who had built a career in marketing before we got married. We had both been focused on building a life together, and when we had kids, it only seemed to make everything more real, more solid. But now, everything felt fragile, like it could crumble at any moment. The first break came a few days after Cameron spoke to me. I found an envelope tucked under the stack of unpaid bills in Melanie's purse, just as I was looking for the car insurance papers. It wasn't sealed, but it was clearly meant to stay hidden. Inside, there was a letter addressed to Rick. It wasn't anything casual. This was a formal document, something that looked official, almost legal. It was a proposal for a legal defense, a joint strategy to accuse me of emotional abuse. The details were chilling. The plan was to frame me as unstable, controlling, even dangerous, using things from our past and twisting them into something unrecognizable. Melanie had apparently even made arrangements with a lawyer, someone who specialized in high-profile divorce cases. My heart sank as I read through the letter. It was all there, her words, her strategy, the timeline of events. They were going to try to take everything from me, my business, our home, and worst of all, custody of the kids. It wasn't just a matter of money or power. This was about destroying my credibility as a father, as a man, and they had been planning it for months. I couldn't just ignore this. I had to act fast. But I couldn't confront Melanie just yet, not without more proof. I needed to know exactly how deep this went. I needed to get ahead of them. Over the next week, I doubled down. I followed Melanie, taking note of the people she was meeting with, the times she came and went. She didn't notice, not at first. There was something about her new attitude that was off, like she had a secret she was keeping from me. She'd become cold, distant, avoiding physical contact. And she kept her phone on her at all times, never leaving it out of sight. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was going on with Rick as well. So I did some digging. Rick had been my friend for years, but now I saw him through a different lens. I went through old emails, work receipts, and phone records. It wasn't long before I found an email exchange between Rick and Melanie that sent a chill through me. It was about a secret meeting they had arranged with a private investigator, a man named Thomas Archer, who specialized in building cases for people who wanted to discredit their spouses. They had been planning to gather information on me to find any evidence they could that could support their claim of emotional abuse. The investigator had already started following me around, taking photos of my interactions with the kids, watching my business dealings, and reporting back to them. I felt sick. Rick, my best friend, had been helping my wife destroy my life. They were using my own privacy against me. The betrayal was sharp and deep, but what hurt most was that they weren't just plotting to take everything from me, they were using my kids as pawns in their game. I needed a plan, and I needed help. That's when I called Ben. Ben was an old friend from college, someone I had kept in touch with over the years. He had gone into law, specializing in family and divorce law. He had represented several high-profile clients in contentious divorces, and I knew he could help me navigate what was coming. I didn't tell him everything at first, just enough to let him know something wasn't right. Ben had always been a steady, reliable guy. After hearing my story, he promised he would help me look into the legal aspects of everything, how to protect my business, my assets, and most importantly, my kids. I'll find out if they're up to anything shady, Ben said, his tone serious. You've got to be careful, Jack. People don't just do this kind of thing without some serious backing. Whoever they've got in their corner isn't someone you want to underestimate. I trusted Ben, but I knew the situation was even worse than he could imagine. I still couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a case of infidelity or betrayal. It was something deeper, something darker. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that what I was dealing with wasn't just a broken marriage. This was about a calculated, ruthless attack on everything I had built. Over the next few days, Ben worked quickly, running background checks and digging into legal records. He found out that Melanie had been meeting with the lawyer and that Rick had been in contact with several other people I didn't know but who seemed to be involved in her plan. It was all beginning to come together, and I wasn't sure if I was ready for it. But I knew one thing for sure. If they thought I was just going to roll over and let them take everything from me, they were wrong. This was war, and I wasn't going to lose without a fight. Then one night, Melanie came to me, her expression calm, almost too calm. I knew something was coming. Jack, she said, her voice softer than it had been in weeks. We need to talk about the kids, about everything. My heart hammered in my chest. This was it. She was going to confront me or worse. She was going to lay her cards on the table. I couldn't tell if I was ready for what she was about to say, but there was no turning back now. I'm listening, I said, keeping my voice steady even though every part of me was screaming to get up and walk away. She paused, studying me for a moment. Then, finally, she spoke. "We've been living a lie, Jack," she said quietly. "And I think you know that now." And in that moment, I realized I wasn't just fighting for my family anymore. I was fighting for my life. She had already chosen her side, and I had no choice but to do the same. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as Melanie spoke. The words were coming out slowly, deliberately, but all I could focus on was the coldness in her eyes. This wasn't the woman I had married. This wasn't the woman who had stood by my side through the rough patches, the sleepless nights, and the hard work of raising our kids. This was someone else, someone I didn't recognize. "We've been living a lie, Jack," she said again, her voice a little quieter this time, like she was trying to ease into the conversation, like she didn't want to shock me too much. "Living a lie?" I repeated, struggling to keep my voice steady. I already knew the truth, or at least part of it. I had seen the letter. I had seen the emails. But hearing her say it out loud, to admit that everything was a facade, that cut deep. She took a slow breath, like she was choosing her words carefully. "I think you know what I'm talking about. The things you've been doing lately. Watching me, following me, going through my things. You're not the man I married anymore." That stung. For a moment, I wanted to shout, to tell her I had every right to know what was going on, to demand an explanation. But something about the way she was speaking, the calmness, made me hesitate. I knew she was about to drop a bombshell, and I had to hear it no matter how badly it hurt. "Melanie, what's going on?" I asked, my voice quiet now. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she stood up and walked over to the window, looking out over the backyard. The sun had just started to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the yard. It felt like time was stretching, like we were stuck in this moment and neither of us knew how to break free. "I'm not happy, Jack," she said, her back to me. "I haven't been for a long time. I don't think I've ever really been happy with you." I could feel my stomach churn, like the ground beneath me had just shifted. "What are you talking about? We've been together for years. We've built a life. You can't just throw all that away." "I'm not throwing anything away," she said, turning back toward me, her eyes sharp. "I've just realized something. You and I, we were never really a match. You're controlling. You always need to be in charge. You never really listened to me. You've always been so focused on your career, your business. And I've been so focused on keeping everything together, trying to keep the peace. But I've changed. And I think you have, too." "Changed?" I echoed. "What are you saying?" She took a deep breath, looking like she was bracing herself for something big. "I'm saying that I'm done. I'm done pretending. I've already made up my mind." My world tilted. "Done pretending? Done with what?" "With us," she said quietly. "With this marriage." My chest tightened. I felt like the air had been knocked out of me. This wasn't the conversation I had expected. This wasn't what I had prepared for. The letters, the emails, the whispers. Those were the signs I'd been trying to decode. But this was something else entirely. "You've made up your mind?" I repeated, struggling to keep my composure. "About what? You're just going to walk away from everything we've built, from me? From the kids?" She looked at me, her expression unreadable. "It's not like that. I've been talking to Rick, Jack. He's been helping me realize a lot of things about myself, about what I want. And I think deep down, you know it too. This isn't working anymore." I stood there, frozen. "Rick? Of course. He had always been there, lurking in the background, always a little too present in our lives. He had been my friend, my confidant, my brother in arms. But now, he was the one helping her destroy everything. I could feel the anger rising in my chest. I took a step forward, my fists clenched at my sides. What did he say to you, Melanie? What kind of things did he put in your head? You're going to listen to him now? The same guy who— Don't, she interrupted, holding up a hand. Don't try to make it about him. This is about me, Jack. I need something different. I've been lost for so long, and Rick, he makes me feel seen. He makes me feel understood in a way you never did. The weight of her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I wanted to scream, to lash out, to do anything to make her take it back, to make her remember the woman I had once known. But instead, I just stood there, staring at her, my mind spinning. What do you want, Melanie? I asked quietly, the fight draining out of me. What are you asking for? I'm asking for a divorce, she said, her voice steady but cold. I'm asking for the freedom to live my life the way I want, without feeling like I'm walking on eggshells all the time, and I want full custody of the kids. The words hit like a freight train, slamming into me with such force that I couldn't breathe for a moment. Full custody. She wanted to take my kids, the one thing I would never let anyone take from me. You're not getting them, Melanie, I said, the words coming out of me before I could stop them. I'm not letting you take my kids. She didn't flinch. I don't want this to get ugly, Jack, but if you want to fight me on this, I will. I will fight dirty if I have to. I've already made arrangements. I've got evidence. Things you've done. Things that will make you look like the villain in all of this. You won't win. The air around me seemed to close in. This wasn't just a divorce anymore. This was war. I could feel my heart racing, the blood pounding in my ears. But I wasn't going to let her destroy everything. I wasn't going to let Rick and Melanie tear apart my life, my family. Not without a fight. You think I'm just going to walk away from this? I said, my voice low and dangerous now. You've made a huge mistake, and you'll regret it. I won't let you use my kids as pawns. Not now. Not ever. She stared at me for a moment, then nodded as if she expected me to say something like that. We'll see, Jack. We'll see who gets to walk away from this in the end. I didn't say anything else. I couldn't. The words didn't matter anymore. The only thing that mattered now was making sure I didn't lose my family. And if it meant fighting every step of the way, I was ready to do it. I turned and walked out of the room, my mind already racing with 1,000 different plans, 1,000 different ways I could fight back. But deep down, a part of me wondered if I was already too late. The drive home from Melanie's felt like a blur. My hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white, my thoughts a tangled mess of anger, disbelief, and fear. What had just happened? The conversation played over and over in my mind, each word she'd spoken cutting deeper than the last. I had always prided myself on knowing how to handle tough situations. But this was a punch I didn't see coming. I tried to focus on the road, but all I could think about were her words. I'm done. I'm done pretending. I've made up my mind. That one kept circling back, like a drumbeat in my head. How had we gotten here? I had known something was off for a while, but I had never imagined it would come to this. Melanie, the woman I thought I knew, the woman who had stood by my side through thick and thin, was walking away. She had already made up her mind. And then, of course, there was Rick. The bastard. I couldn't shake the thought of him. She had admitted it herself. She was seeing him, talking to him, confiding in him. How long had this been going on? Had it started before? Or was he just the catalyst for all this? Did he really know how to make her feel understood? Or had he just exploited the cracks that had formed in our marriage, like some predator waiting for the right moment to strike? When I pulled into the driveway, I didn't immediately get out of the car. I sat there for a few minutes, the engine still idling, watching the lights flicker on in the house. Inside, the kids were likely settling in, oblivious to the storm that was brewing outside. Sophie, my youngest, would be playing her violin. Ethan, my oldest, probably up in his room studying or doing homework. They had no idea what had just transpired between their mother and me. I couldn't let them see me like this. I couldn't let them see how much I was falling apart. I finally opened the car door and stepped out, my feet heavy on the ground. The air was crisp, and the sun had just set, casting long shadows across the lawn. I could feel the weight of the night pressing down on me. Everything felt too quiet, too still. Inside the house, I took a deep breath before walking in. Sophie was in the living room playing her violin, lost in the music. Her little face was so focused, so innocent. I watched her for a moment, her fingers moving over the strings with ease, and for a split second, I felt a flicker of peace. But it was fleeting. Ethan was sitting at the kitchen table, his head buried in a stack of books. He glanced up when he saw me, offering a distracted smile. "Hey, Dad. How was work?" I forced a smile, pushing the conversation back to a neutral ground. "Same as usual. You know how it goes." But Ethan could always sense when something was off. He was the kind of kid who picked up on the smallest shifts in the atmosphere, and I could tell from the way he looked at me now that he could tell something was wrong. But he didn't press. He just went back to his books, though his eyes kept flicking up at me like he was trying to gauge my mood. I walked past him, heading upstairs. I needed a moment, a few minutes to think, to breathe, before I dealt with whatever came next. I had only just sat down on the edge of the bed when my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, almost expecting it to be Melanie. But it wasn't. It was Rick. I stared at the message for a long moment, unsure of what to do. Part of me wanted to throw the phone across the room, to burn the bridge completely and never speak to him again. But then another part of me, the part that knew this wasn't over, knew that confronting him was the only way forward. I couldn't let him slink into the shadows, manipulate everything from behind the scenes while my family crumbled. The message was simple. We need to talk. Meet me tomorrow. Same place. I stared at it for a while longer. What exactly did he think he could accomplish? What did he want? I thought about the things I'd learned about him over the years, the whispers, the rumors, the things Melanie had never told me. There was so much I didn't know about him, about their relationship, about what had been going on behind my back. But I wasn't going to let him play me anymore. I was done being the fool. I thumbed a reply. I'm coming. I didn't have the time or the energy to wonder about what that meant for me. The only thing that mattered now was protecting what was mine. My family. My kids. I put the phone down and stood up, walking over to the window. The night was dark, the sky a canvas of deep blues and purples. I couldn't shake the feeling that everything was slipping through my fingers. Melanie was gone, Rick was plotting, and I had no idea where I stood in this new reality. I didn't know how much longer I could keep everything together. The next morning, I barely slept. I'd been up half the night replaying everything in my mind. At one point, I even got up and went to the kitchen to get some water, thinking that maybe a glass of something cold would help calm my nerves. But it didn't. Nothing did. When the morning finally arrived, I found myself pacing around the house, unsure of what to do. I couldn't face the kids yet. Not with everything hanging in the air. I had to get out. I had to face Rick. So, After a quick breakfast, I left the house without telling anyone. I couldn't stand the idea of looking Ethan or Sophie in the eye and pretending like everything was fine. I drove to the old warehouse where I used to meet Rick. It was an abandoned building on the outskirts of town, the kind of place where shady deals were made and dirty secrets were buried. It had been years since I'd been there, but somehow it felt fitting that it was still our place. When I arrived, Rick was already there, standing by his truck with a cigarette in his hand. He looked the same as always, too casual, too self-assured, as if nothing had changed, as if this was just another one of our usual conversations. He looked up when I parked, flicking the cigarette to the ground and crushing it under his boot. "You came," he said, the words flat, but with that signature smugness I hated. "Yeah," I said, walking toward him. "Let's talk." Rick gave me a half smile, the kind that made my blood boil. "I knew you'd see reason eventually." "Cut the crap," I snapped. "I'm not here for your games. What the hell did you do to my wife?" He didn't flinch. "What makes you think I did anything to her, Jack? Maybe she came to me because I'm the one who listens." "Don't act like you're the good guy here," I growled. "You've been playing her from the start. You've been lying to her, getting inside her head, and you've been tearing my family apart. I won't let you get away with it." Rick's eyes darkened. "I'm not the villain here. You've always been too busy to notice what was right in front of you." But Melanie, she finally woke up, and now she's free. I took a step forward, my fists clenched. "You won't win, Rick. Not this time." He met my gaze, the coldness in his eyes making the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "We'll see about that, Jack." And with that, he turned and walked away. I stood there for a long time, just staring after him, knowing that this was just the beginning of the battle. I had no idea what was going to happen next. But I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to lose my family without a fight. Not now. Not ever. The war had begun. When I got home, the house was quieter than usual. It wasn't even noon yet, but the kids were out, likely with friends or at school activities, leaving me with nothing but my thoughts and the weight of the conversation I'd just had with Rick. I walked through the door, dropping my keys onto the kitchen counter, my mind racing. I didn't even know where to start or if I even wanted to start at all. Melanie wasn't home yet, and part of me wondered if she would ever come back. I made myself a cup of coffee, my hands shaking slightly as I poured the hot liquid into a mug. The silence in the house pressed in on me like it was trying to suffocate me. I thought about the way Rick had walked away from me earlier, so damn smug, as if the whole thing was some kind of game. But it wasn't a game for me. This was my life. I had to find a way to fix it. As I sipped my coffee, my mind drifted back to my conversation with Rick. It was clear now that he saw this as some kind of victory, like he'd won some personal war by getting into Melanie's head. He was trying to destabilize everything, to turn the situation into something chaotic and unpredictable. The worst part was that it was working. I'd always been the one to keep things together, to hold the family up when times got tough. But now, I wasn't sure how much longer I could do that. I had no idea what was going to happen next. But I knew one thing. I couldn't just stand by and let Rick and Melanie tear everything apart. My phone buzzed on the counter, breaking my thoughts. I picked it up, expecting a message from Melanie. But it wasn't her. It was from Ethan. "Dad, can we talk?" I swallowed hard. I could feel the tension building in my chest. I hadn't told him about what was going on with Melanie. I hadn't told either of the kids. But they were sharp. They knew something was wrong. Ethan was old enough now to see through the facade. I typed back quickly. "Sure, what's up?" A few seconds later, my phone buzzed again. I know something's wrong. You and Mom, what's going on? I leaned against the counter, staring at the screen. The last thing I wanted to do was drag my son into this mess. But there was no way around it. If I didn't tell him, he'd figure it out eventually, and the last thing I wanted was for him to hear it from someone else. I took a deep breath, then typed back. We'll talk when you get home, okay? Just don't worry about it right now. A pause. Then, I'll be home soon. I set my phone down and ran a hand through my hair, feeling the weight of the world pressing down on me. How was I supposed to explain this to him? How could I explain it to anyone? The doorbell rang, interrupting my thoughts. I wasn't expecting anyone, and a part of me tensed instinctively, expecting it to be Rick. Maybe he'd come back, trying to pick up where he left off, pushing harder this time. But when I opened the door, it wasn't Rick. It was Melanie. She stood there for a moment, just looking at me. Her face was unreadable, her eyes avoiding mine, and there was something in her posture that told me she wasn't here for a conversation. I need to talk to you, she said quietly, her voice low and hesitant. I stepped aside, letting her into the house. It wasn't a warm welcome. It was more like a necessary pause before the inevitable storm. She walked in slowly, glancing around like she wasn't sure where to start. I stood in the hallway, my arms crossed, waiting for her to speak first. I couldn't make the first move. Not after everything that had happened. I know I've hurt you, she began, her voice cracking slightly. I don't want to hurt you anymore. I clenched my jaw, forcing myself not to respond immediately. I had heard her say that before. Hell, I had even believed it before. But I didn't know if I could trust it now. Then why did you do it? I finally asked, my voice coming out sharper than I intended. Why did you let him into our lives like that? Why did you let Rick mess with everything? You know what he's capable of. You know who he is. Melanie winced at the mention of Rick's name, but she didn't back down. She took a step forward, lowering her voice. It wasn't like that. You think I don't know who he is? I do. But you don't understand what it's like, Jack. I was feeling lost. I needed someone who saw me, who understood what I was going through. I didn't know who else to turn to. I stared at her, my chest tight with frustration and hurt. So you went to Rick, the same guy who's been trying to tear us apart for years, the guy who's manipulated you before, and you just let him back in? She nodded, her eyes brimming with tears now. I didn't see it at first, but I don't know. He listens, Jack. He makes me feel like I matter. I shook my head, disbelief washing over me. That's it? That's your excuse? He makes you feel like you matter? So you throw everything we've built away? I didn't want to, she said softly, but her words felt hollow. I didn't want to hurt you, but I couldn't ignore what I was feeling anymore. I swallowed hard, trying to push back the rising anger. And what about us? What about the family? What about Ethan and Sophie? Did you think about them, Melanie? Did you think about what this is doing to them, to me? She was silent for a moment, and I could see the guilt written all over her face. She hadn't thought about any of that. It was all about her needs, her emotions, her brokenness. I had spent years making sure she knew she was loved and supported, but somewhere along the way, I had failed to see her slipping away. I know I've been selfish, she whispered, but I didn't know what else to do. I don't know how to fix this. There it was again, the desperate plea for understanding, for redemption. I didn't have it in me to give her that. Not right now, Melanie, I said, my voice low and steady. I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know if I can forgive you for this. I can't do this alone anymore. You have to figure out what you want. Because I'm done trying to fix everything for you. You've got to take responsibility for your part in this." She nodded, tears falling freely now. She looked broken. She looked like a person who knew she had lost everything. But I couldn't comfort her. Not after everything. Not after the way she'd betrayed us all. There was a long silence, thick and heavy, before she spoke again, her voice trembling. "I don't want to lose you, Jack. I don't want to lose our family." I took a deep breath, staring at her. "Then stop running. Start thinking about us, about what we've built. But it's not just about you anymore. It's about everyone. It's about our kids, Melanie. Don't you get that?" Her lips trembled, and for a brief moment I thought I saw something like recognition in her eyes, but she didn't say anything more. Instead, she turned and walked toward the door. "I'll be back later," she said quietly before stepping out, leaving me standing there, the weight of her words hanging in the air between us. I stood in the doorway watching her go, not sure what was going to happen next. The battle wasn't over. Far from it. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like I might be able to fight back. I wasn't going to lose my family without a fight. No matter what it took, the war was far from over. The next few days passed in a blur of tense silence. Melanie had left that night without another word, and I didn't see her for the next couple of days. Part of me was relieved. I needed space to think, to figure out where I stood in all of this. But the other part of me, the part that still cared for her deeply, felt hollow. I wasn't sure if she was just gone for a while or if she was walking away for good. The house felt empty without her. The kids were at school, and I spent most of my time trying to keep my mind occupied. Work wasn't much of a distraction anymore. I had been carrying the weight of all this for weeks now, and the strain was starting to show. I found myself snapping at people for small things, my patience wearing thin. Then, one evening, Melanie came back. She didn't knock. She just opened the door and walked in like she had every right to. Her eyes were red, and her face was drawn, but there was a firmness in her posture that wasn't there before. I looked up from the couch where I had been sitting, staring at the TV without really seeing it. It felt like everything had stopped moving, like I was stuck in a moment that I couldn't escape from. "I need to talk," she said, her voice surprisingly steady, though there was still an undercurrent of emotion in it. I set the remote down, not sure what I expected. Part of me wanted to get up and leave, walk out the door, get away from it all. But the bigger part, no. The part of me that still loved her, that still wanted to believe in the person I'd married, held me in place. "Talk," I said simply, sitting back in my chair, crossing my arms over my chest. "I went to see Rick," she said quietly, avoiding my eyes. "I needed to understand why I did what I did. I couldn't let it go without getting some kind of answer." I froze, my heart skipping a beat. My thoughts immediately flashed to the worst-case scenario. Had she gone back to him? Had she gotten tangled up in his lies again? I didn't go back to him, she rushed to say, her voice shaking. But I had to understand why I felt so lost, why I let him get under my skin like that. I had to confront him, face him. "And?" I asked, keeping my tone even, though it took everything I had not to sound accusing. "I realized something," she said, sitting down across from me. Her eyes met mine now, and there was something raw and vulnerable in her gaze. "I wasn't looking for Rick. I was looking for myself. I've been so caught up in trying to please everyone, trying to be everything to everyone, that I lost sight of who I am. I didn't know how to find my way back. And that's what he offered me. Clarity. I thought he had the answers, but he didn't. He was just another way of hiding from the truth. I sat back in my chair, trying to process her words. There was a part of me that wanted to believe her, wanted to accept what she was saying at face value. But I knew it wasn't that simple. "You know who I am, Melanie," I said softly, my voice still steady but with a hint of something else. Hurt. "I've been here all along. I've supported you through everything. But you've been shutting me out, not just from your emotions, but from the reality of what's been happening. And now you expect me to just accept that you were looking for clarity?" She flinched at my words, but she didn't look away. I know I messed up. But I've spent the last few days thinking, I don't want to hide anymore. I don't want to keep pretending everything's okay when it's not. I leaned forward, placing my elbows on my knees. "Then what does that mean, Melanie? What are you saying?" "I'm saying that I want to fix this. I want to be here with you and the kids. I want to really be here, not just in the physical sense, but emotionally. I want to start over, but I know that's not going to be easy. I've hurt you, and I can't just erase that. But I want to try." My chest tightened. Her words were what I wanted to hear, but the scars from what had happened weren't going to disappear, just because she'd had a moment of clarity. "Melanie," I started, but my voice faltered for a moment. "This isn't going to be easy. I can't just forget what you've done, and I can't just pretend that things are normal. They're not. But I'm willing to try. I'm willing to see if we can rebuild from this." She nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "I know. I don't expect you to forgive me overnight. I needed to tell you how I feel, Jack. For so long, I've been running, hiding, not knowing how to fix things. But I'm ready now. I'm ready to face the truth." I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of everything pressing down on me. I wasn't sure if I could ever truly forgive her for everything she'd done. But I knew I wasn't ready to give up either. For the kids, for myself, I had to at least try. "Okay," I said, my voice low but firm. "We'll try. But you need to understand something. This is going to take time. And we'll have to face the mess we've made together." "I understand," she whispered, her face softening. "I'll do whatever it takes, Jack, I swear." I sat back again, looking at her with a mixture of exhaustion and something else. Hope, maybe. For the first time in a long while, I felt like there was a chance, a slim one, but a chance nonetheless. She stood up then, walking over to me and placing a hand on my shoulder. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. For everything." I looked up at her, seeing the vulnerability in her eyes. Maybe it was the exhaustion or the weight of everything we'd been through. But I didn't push her away. Instead, I reached up and squeezed her hand, a silent acknowledgement that I was still here. "I know," I said, my voice quiet but steady. "And I'm still here too. We'll figure this out. Together." The air between us was heavy with unspoken promises and the weight of what we'd both lost. But I knew we couldn't undo the past. All we had was today, and I wasn't ready to let go of that just yet. That night, we sat in silence, the house still and quiet around us. There were no grand gestures, no sweeping declarations of love or forgiveness. There was just the reality of where we were. But maybe that was enough, for now. And maybe, just maybe, it would be enough to start again. The days that followed were a delicate balance between healing and rebuilding. I wasn't sure if what Melanie and I had was salvageable, but I knew that if there was a chance, We had to take it. There were no guarantees, no quick fixes, but one thing was certain. We couldn't keep running from the truth, from what had happened, or from each other. The kids sensed the shift in the air. They had always been aware, even when they didn't fully understand. The tension in the house had been palpable for months. But now, things were quieter. Not perfect, far from it, but quieter in a way that felt like a pause. A collective breath before the storm or the calm. Emma, our oldest, was the first to address it, though she didn't have the words for it yet. She was 14, but she had always been perceptive beyond her years. I found her in the kitchen one evening playing with the edges of her dinner plate, her eyes unfocused. "You and Mom okay?" she asked, not looking up. The question wasn't accusatory, just curious. Still, it hit me like a brick to the chest. I thought about everything we'd been through, all the fractures and the long road ahead. But then I remembered that, like Melanie, my kids were hurting, too. They had seen their world shift beneath their feet, their sense of normal ripped apart, and they needed answers. Maybe not all the answers, but at least enough to know that things would be okay. "We're working on it, kiddo," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "It's going to take time, but we're trying. We both are." She nodded slowly, absorbing my words in her own way. She didn't need a long explanation. Not yet. She just needed to know we were trying, that we hadn't given up. After dinner that night, I found Melanie sitting alone in the living room looking out the window. She was lost in thought, and for a second, I hesitated before walking in. We had been talking more, but it still felt like walking on eggshells at times. Our conversations were no longer filled with anger, but there was an underlying caution, like both of us were waiting for something either good or bad, to happen. "Hey," I said softly as I sat down beside her. She glanced at me, offering a small, tired smile. "Hey." We sat in silence for a moment. The weight of everything we'd been through hung between us, but it didn't feel as suffocating as it once had. There was still so much unspoken, but the space felt a little more comfortable, like maybe we could exist in it together. "I've been thinking," she began, and I could hear the vulnerability in her voice. "I know I can't fix everything overnight, and I know I hurt you in ways that can't just be erased, but I want to try. I want to do the work. For you. For us." Her words were simple, but they meant everything. For the first time in a long while, I truly believed she meant it. Maybe we couldn't go back to the way things were, but maybe that was okay. Maybe what we needed was something new, a different version of ourselves, of our family. "I know," I said, my voice rough, "and I'm willing to try too, but we both have to commit. I'm not asking for perfection, but we need to face the hard stuff, together, every bit of it." "I know," she repeated softly. "And I'm ready. I really am." We didn't kiss that night. We didn't have to. There was no need for grand gestures anymore, just small moments that proved we were still here, still trying. The weeks that followed weren't easy. We made progress. Yes, but it was slow and painful. We had therapy sessions, individual and together, that forced us to confront the damage we'd caused. I hadn't realized how much I'd buried until the emotions started to surface. The anger, the betrayal, the sense of abandonment. But Melanie, too, was confronting her own demons, unraveling the knots of guilt and shame that had kept her trapped in the past. There were days when we took a step back, when the weight of everything felt like too much. But there were also moments, small ones, that reminded me why we had to keep fighting. A shared laugh at the dinner table. A touch that wasn't just out of obligation, but out of a real, genuine desire to connect. One Saturday morning, after weeks of quiet mornings spent mostly in separate corners of the house, we went for a walk. The weather had shifted. The oppressive heat of summer was finally giving way to the cool breezes of fall. The air smelled like fresh leaves and damp earth, and for the first time in a long time, it felt like the world wasn't as heavy. "I've been thinking," Melanie said, as we walked side by side, her hand brushing mine. I glanced over at her, surprised. It had been a while since we'd had a real conversation outside of the practicalities of daily life. "Yeah? About what?" "About the future," she said quietly. "About what comes next. I know it's going to take time, but I don't want to keep living like we're in limbo. I want to start building something real again." I nodded, my heart beating a little faster. She was right. We couldn't stay in this state of uncertainty forever. But at the same time, I knew the road ahead would be long, filled with more difficult conversations, more confrontations with the past. I was ready for that, though. We had to be. "We'll take it, day by day," I said, offering her a small, hopeful smile. "But I think we can make it work. If we keep showing up for each other even when it's hard, we can make it." She smiled back. A real smile this time, not the guarded one she'd worn for so long. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. For the first time in ages, it felt like maybe we could actually build something new, something better than what we had before. That afternoon, we spent time together as a family, taking the kids to the park, letting them run wild while we sat on a bench, just talking. It wasn't perfect. We still had a long way to go, but as I watched Emma and Jake playing, laughing with their mother, I felt something shift inside of me. Maybe the damage we'd all gone through had broken us, but it had also forged something stronger. A new beginning. A foundation built on honesty, even when it was painful. And maybe that was the most important thing we could give to each other, to ourselves. We had a long road ahead, but for the first time in a while, I wasn't afraid of it. In the end, that's what mattered. Here's the next story. The steady tapping of Alexander Lee's fingers on the chrome armrest echoed throughout Metro General Hospital's examining room. Outside the window, autumn leaves were spread over the parking lot. Their movement provides a dramatic contrast to the pristine whiteness indoors. At 45, Alexander's old hands showed the calluses of 2 decades of work, each a tribute to the enterprise he founded from the bottom up, Tracy Payne. Lee's manicured fingers interlocked, her wedding ring catching the fluorescent light. After 18 years of marriage, he understood every nuance of her touch. But today, things felt different. Mechanical, possibly. Rehearsed. What about the calves? "It's probably just stress," Tracy stated, her voice bearing an unusual sense of tension. "You've worked too hard on the new development project." Alexander cleared his throat and suppressed another cough. Maybe. But Jonathan insisted on the testing. The door opened with a faint click as Dr. Jonathan Griffith took a casual step, his eyes showing no gravity. The heavy manila folder in his hands could as well have been made of lead for the manner he handled Alex Tracy. Jonathan started bringing up his rolling stool. The informal use of their names, a throwback to their college days, couldn't disguise his professional demeanor. "I've received your test results." Alexander felt Tracy's hand tremble against his. Her other hand went into her purse, fingertips brushing against the phone. "The images reveal a lump in your left lung," Jonathan continued, his remarks measured and cautious. "The biopsy reveals that it is cancerous. Stage 3, non-small cell lung cancer." The words hung in the air like smoke. Alexander's construction-trained mind quickly started calculating angles, measuring distances, and devising solutions. But this wasn't a structure he could repair with blueprints and meticulous design. "What is the survival rate?" Alexander inquired, his entrepreneurial sense pulling him towards data. He understood concrete numbers. Jonathan leaned forward and aggressively distributed numerous scan photos around the little table. "The 5-year survival rate is approximately 30%. But Alex, you are younger than most of the people we treat with this diagnosis. Your general health is good. We have several therapy choices accessible." Tracy's phone was busted. She took a short glimpse at it before putting it aside. "What are the therapy options?" "We're considering a mixed strategy," Jonathan explained, pulling out several brochures. "Chemotherapy will be our major weapon, but we should also consider radiation therapy. There are also a few promising clinical trials." Tracy's phone vibrated again. This time, she stood swiftly, her chair scrapping across the linoleum flooring. "I need some air," she murmured, her voice thick with what Alexander imagined was emotion. Her phone clattered to the chair as she hurried out. Alexander reached for the device, meaning to deliver it to her. The screen lit up with another notification, and his world moved on its axis. Rick Nunez, a name familiar to me for 20 years, appeared in the message preview. The words that followed chilled Alexander's blood. "Babe, finally. Now we don't have to poison him gradually. Nature is doing our job. Once he's gone, the child has already committed to testify that he was abusive. So we receive everything." Alexander's hands trembled as he gripped the phone, leaving the medical brochures scattering at his feet. He turned the screen to face Jonathan, whose professional attitude crumbled as he read the message. "My God, Alex," Jonathan muttered hastily as he closed the door Tracy had left open. "Whatever you do next, don't tell them you saw this. Don't make them suspect anything is wrong." Alexander gazed at the phone, his thoughts racing across years of recollections. Rick Nunez, his best friend from college, the best man in his wedding, godfather to his children, the man who had helped him start his construction company and had spent many weekends at their house. Who had coached Marcus's Little League team? The kids. Alexander managed to make his voice harsh. "Emma and Marcus. They are saying, 'My children.'" Jonathan moved closer, speaking quietly. "Listen attentively, Alex. You are currently facing 2 conflicts, both of which are truly life or death. We need to get started on your treatment quickly, but you also have to safeguard yourself and your children. Do you have someone you can trust? Someone Tracy and Rick wouldn't suspect?" Alexander's thoughts turned to a recent project. A house adaptation he'd completed for a crippled veteran son. Glenn Massey, a retired Marine Corps intelligence officer, pressed on payment despite Alexander's promise to do so at a cost. They had spent several evenings conversing while the work was being completed, and Glenn had given Alexander his card along with a promise. "Call me if you ever need anything, day or night." "I might," Alexander said, swiftly transferring the message to his email and removing it from Tracy's phone. "I might have someone." The door handle turned, and Tracy reappeared. Her composure was regained. She smiled apologetically, but the expression did not reach her eyes. "Sorry for that." It was simply overpowering. Of course, Jonathan responded easily, handing her back her phone. Alexander sat in a fog during the consultation, nodding at appropriate intervals as his mind raced. Tracy's touch suddenly felt like a serpent's caress. Every concerned look she gave him conveyed the weight of years of lying. He kept up his charade, remembering Jonathan's warning. As they left the hospital, Tracy's hand rests on his arm. Alexander thought of his children, Emma, 17, who aspired to be an architect like her father Marcus, 15, who had inherited his passion of baseball and construction. What lies had they been told? What kind of poison had been spilled into their ears? "I will drive," Tracy offered, her voice soft. "You've got enough shocks for the day." If only you knew. Alexander considered following her to their car. He took out his phone, purportedly to check work messages, but his fingers moved to type a text to Glenn Massey. Need your assistance? A matter of life and death. Can we meet tonight? The response arrived nearly instantly. My office. 8 p.m. Come alone. Glenn Massey's underground office didn't resemble the conventional private investigator Dan from noir films. Instead, it resembled a military command center with many monitors showing surveillance feeds and a wall of complex machinery humming quietly in the background. The room reeked of coffee and gun oil, and the one concession to comfort was a faded leather couch where Alexander sat now, his hands curled around a mug of black coffee. Glenn said, "Run it by me again." His military short gray hair reflects the blue light from the monitors. Every detail important. Alexander described the day's events, his voice becoming more powerful as he spoke. Glenn's presence provided a calming impact. Here was someone who had dealt with crises before, someone who understood strategy and survival. The message mentions poison. Glenn was typing quickly on one of his keyboards. Have you had any other strange symptoms than the cough? Alexander instinctively reached for his throat. The cough began approximately 6 months ago. Tracy has been quite keen that I take several vitamins, which she claims would help improve my immune system. Glenn's typing stopped. We'll need samples of everything you've been taking, so Alex stopped taking them immediately. You believe they genuinely exist. I believe we start with the worst-case scenario and work our way backwards. Glenn brought up various databases on his displays. Rick Nunez, you said. Let's see what we can find out about your best friend in the next 2 weeks. While Alexander began his early cancer treatments, Glenn's inquiry revealed a pattern that made the original transgression appear virtually insignificant in comparison. Look at this. Glenn commented one evening while distributing surveillance photographs around his desk. Rick isn't only sleeping with Tracy. He has been steadily embezzling from your company via a series of ghost contracts. Alexander reviewed the documents. His builder's eye detects anomalies in material ordering and labor expenses. These invoices are for projects we never completed. Exactly. And that's only the beginning. Glenn opened financial documents on his main screen. They have taken out additional life insurance plans. In your name. The signatures are convincing forgeries, but the dates are telling. Each policy was purchased soon after your initial symptoms arose. Alexander leaned back and ran a hand over his thinning hair. The chemotherapy had already begun to take its toll, but the proof of such planned betrayal was more devastating than any treatment. How about my children? He asked, dreading the response. Glenn's expression clouded. That's where things become worse. I've been watching their communications, and he reached for a separate folder. You must see this. But first I want you to prepare by reading transcripts of Tracy and Rick's text messages and emails, as well as different visits with child psychologists. The methodical manipulation of his children's memory was described in therapeutic detail. Glenn mentioned that they have been working on this for many years. Selective reinforcement of bad experiences, subtle hints, and even fabricating fake memories of events that never occurred. They've been using a technique known as memory implantation on both Emma and Marcus Alexander. Read through the transcripts. His hands were shaking with wrath. How could they do this to children, especially their own children? That's the other thing, Glenn explained gently. I don't believe they intended to keep the youngsters around once they got what they wanted. He played an audio tape of Tracy and Rick's voices, which filled the room. Tracy's voice remarked, Once we get their testimony and the insurance money, we'll have to disappear. The kids will only complicate things. They're old enough to go their own way, Rick responded. Furthermore, they will never forgive us once they understand what we did. It's better to make a clean break. Alexander rose to his feet and paced the length of Glenn's office. I need to tell them. I need to show them what's happening. Not yet, Glenn warned. We need more. We have to catch them in the act. Document everything. If we move too quickly, they will reject everything. And right now, your children are more likely to believe them than you. The video footage was displayed on Glenn's largest monitor. Even though it was filmed through a window at Rick's lake house, the high-definition image was crystal clear. Alexander saw his heart fall as Tracy and Rick sat with Emma and Marcus on the exquisite leather couch Rick had never told him he possessed. Try to recall Emma. Tracy's voice came via the directional microphone. You were 7, maybe 8. Your father had been drinking. I don't miss the expression twisted in perplexity. I recall being afraid, but Rick prompted gently, his hand on his shoulder. Remember the plate that he threw? Emma's eyes widened. Yes, I remember now. He was quite angry. Alexander grasped the arms of his chair. I've never thrown anything. I've never even raised my voice at them. Dr. Claire McPherson added, That's the insidious part. Glenn had called in a child psychologist for consultation. They aren't simply lying to your children. They are genuinely modifying their memories. The human mind is incredibly adaptable, particularly in terms of formative experiences. Marcus shuffled uneasily across the screen. I don't remember Dad hurling anything, Tracy remarked calmly. You were younger. We sometimes block off terrible memories to protect ourselves, but they still exist, honey. That is why you become anxious when others raise their voices. Remember Marcus pulling on a loose thread on his sleeve? A habit Alexander recognized whenever his son was upset. I suppose, but Dad has never scared me. Not really. Rick interjected. That is fear talking. It's okay, buddy. We are here to help you remember the truth. Glenn halted the footage. Marcus is the weak link in their network. He is demonstrating resistance to the implanted memories. If we're going to break this open, he may be our best option. Alexander peered at the frozen image of his children, his hands quivering slightly after his most recent round of chemotherapy. They're taking everything from them, not just their father, but also their authentic memories and sense of reality. We won't let that happen. Glenn promised that his military bearing would become more prominent. We are going to save your children and hold them accountable for every lie they have said. Dr. McPherson nodded in accord. Once we've exposed the manipulation, we may start proper therapy to assist them distinguish between fact and implanted fiction. But Glenn is correct. We must move gently. A premature encounter could draw them deeper into Tracy and Rick's story. Alexander stood and moved closer to the television. He touched the image of his children's faces, causing a smudge on the display. How much more evidence do we need? We are so near, Glenn reassured him. My FBI contacts are preparing a case for criminal charges. We only need to catch them directly plotting their next move. Continue going to your therapies. Continue to act normally. Let them believe their scheme is working. Alexander nodded. His builders are already planning a different type of project. Not of wood or steel, but of truth and justice. He would reestablish his family's foundation even stronger than before. But first, he needed to painstakingly deconstruct the web of lies that threatened to destroy all he valued. Whatever it takes, he said calmly, his voice full of the same resolve that had helped him build his company from the ground up. Whatever it takes to save my kids. Sylvia Sawyer's corner office, which overlooked the city's central core, had windows stained with early morning rain. The criminal defense attorney's workstation lacked the normal family portraits and personal touches, instead featuring orderly stacks of case files and a solitary, potted succulent. Glenn had recommended her for exactly this reason. She lived for her profession, and her 90% success rate demonstrated this. "Walk me through the timeline again." Sylvia spoke as her Mont Blanc pen hovered over a legal pad. She had already taken 3 pages of notes during their 2-hour discussion. "When did you notice the supplements?" Alexander pulled out his phone and checked the calendar app. His memory was occasionally hazy as a result of the chemotherapy. "Tracy started taking vitamins about 8 months ago. She told me that small white pills would improve my immune system. The cough began 2 months later." Alexander's fingers moved to his throat, a habit he had adopted since the diagnosis. She insisted on the supplements. "He'd watch me take them every morning." Sylvia scratched her pen across the paper. "Glenn, we will need those medications evaluated. Can your lab contacts manage this discreetly?" Glenn nodded from his place beside the window. "We've already submitted samples to a private lab in Virginia. Should have results by the end of the week." "Good." Sylvia switched to a new page. "Now we'll talk about the company's finances. Rick produced these ghost contracts. I need every detail." Alexander spread out the financial documents on Sylvia's desk. "His builders. I discovered disparities that others could have overlooked. Do you see these material orders? The quantities do not match any of our actual projects." And here he pointed to a number of invoices. "These labor costs are for a team that does not exist. How long has Rick had access to your company's financials?" "He helped me launch the company 20 years ago. Since then, I've handled the majority of the accounting work." Alexander's voice crackled. "I trusted him with everything." Sylvia's expression relaxed slightly. That's precisely what predators like Rick rely on. Trust is their hunting ground. She opened another file on her computer. "Look at this." The screen displayed police reports from 3 separate states. Rick's name appeared in each one, albeit with minor modifications. Richard Nunez, Rick Nunez Martinez, and RJ Nunez followed the same pattern in each case. Sylvia revealed that he targeted successive company owners, particularly those in construction or real estate, often through their spouses. The affairs endure 2 to 3 years. When the money is out, he systematically drains the companies. Both he and his wife vanish. But what about the children? Alexander's hands tightened. They have never targeted youngsters before. That's what distinguishes your case. Dr. Claire McPherson entered the office, bringing a new voice to the discourse. The child psychologist had a large folder of her own. Her professional demeanor concealed obvious concern. Dr. McPherson Sylvia rose to greet her. "Thank you for coming at such short notice. Call me Claire." She took a seat close to Alexander. "I reviewed the video material Glenn provided. What they are doing to your children is a type of psychological torture known as memory implantation. It is similar to the strategies used in cult programming." Alexander's throat clenched. "Can it be reversed with appropriate treatment?" "Yes. But we need to document everything first. Every session they have with the kids, every tale they share, it is all proof of systematic abuse." Glenn's phone vibrated. He checked it. His expression darkened. "Speaking of documentation, they have planned another therapy appointment with the children for tomorrow." "Where?" Sylvia asked. "Rick's lake house again? They appear to be prepared for these sessions." Claire responded, "We'll have audio and visual coverage," with a professional tone but angry eyes. "Every falsehood they tell those kids puts another nail in their legal coffin." Alexander pulled himself to his feet, fighting chemotherapy-induced nausea. The most recent round of therapy had been especially unpleasant, but he forced himself to focus. What's the next step? Sylvia sorted the documents into tidy piles. We create an airtight case. Every financial transaction, fake paper, and manipulative session with children. We document everything. Glenn, surveillance provides the evidence. Claire delivers expert testimony regarding psychological abuse. And I'll make sure it holds up in court for the kids. Alexander's voice conveyed the weight of a father's concern. How will we safeguard them while this happens? Claire told us to watch and wait. Any early action could lead them deeper into Tracy and Rick's story. We need kids to start questioning things on their own. As if on cue, Glenn's phone rang again. He raised his eyebrows as he read the message. That might come sooner than we expected. Marcus just texted his mother, asking to pay Alexander a visit in the hospital tomorrow. Alexander's heart leaped. He hasn't made a visit since the diagnosis. This might be significant, Claire warned. But remember, no confrontations or accusations, simply listen and observe. Marcus should come to his realizations organically. The hospital room's afternoon light forms lengthy shadows across Alexander's bed. The chemotherapy trickled smoothly, keeping rhythm like a metronome. He timed this treatment purposefully so that Marcus could see the reality of his condition. Not for compassion, but for the truth. Marcus approached cautiously. His lanky teenage figure seemed to fold in on itself. At 15, he was as tall as his father, but now he appears smaller, uncertain. "Hey, Dad." Marcus hesitated near the door, hands jammed inside his jacket pockets. "You look like I'm battling cancer." Alexander gave a feeble smile. "It's fine to say it." Marcus came closer, taking the chair next to the bed. His gaze shifted to the 4 bags, the monitors, and the remnants of his father's war. "Does it hurt?" Cancer treatments can be quite potent at times. Alexander kept his tone neutral, factual. "But my doctors say I'm doing great." A nurse entered to check Alexander's vitals, nodding approvingly before leaving them alone. The stillness stretched between father and son, filled with unanswered questions. Finally, Marcus said, barely above a whisper, "Dad, something does not feel right." Alexander's heart raced, but his countenance remained calm. "What do you mean?" "Last week I overheard Mom and Rick arguing. They had no idea I was home. I had forgotten my baseball glove and returned early from practice." Marcus grabbed at a loose thread on his sleeve, precisely like he did in the video. Rick mentioned sticking to the story, and Mom argued they couldn't risk the children finding out the truth. Alexander's hands grasped the hospital blanket, but he made them relax. That must have been confusing to hear, along with the memories they keep bringing up. Marcus looked up and searched his father's face. "The plate you allegedly flung. I keep trying to remember it, but it doesn't feel right. It's like trying to remember a movie I've never seen." Years of construction experience had taught Alexander the value of a strong foundation. You couldn't construct anything lasting on shifting sand. He considered his words carefully before speaking. "Marcus, what do you remember from your childhood? Not what you were told to remember. What do you really remember?" The boy's brow furrowed with concentration. "I remember you showing me how to utilize tools in your workshop. You were always very attentive to make sure I learned about safety first. And then I get frustrated because I can't do things correctly. You've never yelled. You simply say, 'Measure twice, cut once.' They conclude together." "Are those true memories?" Marcus inquired, his voice cracking. "This is not like the other items." Alexander grasped for his son's hand. When Marcus refused to pull away, he felt a rush of relief. "I have never and will never hurt you or your sister. Every memory of love, patience, and shared teaching and learning. These are real. Marcus's shoulders began to shiver. Mom and Rick have been lying to us. They've been leading us to think things that never happened. I believe, Alexander said cautiously. It's time to see something. He motioned toward the corner of the room where Glenn had been sitting silently, almost unseen in the shadows. Glenn opened his laptop and accessed one of the taped therapy sessions. Marcus noticed his face losing color as he observed himself and Emma being instructed. Tracy and Rick were very careful with their suggestions. Twisted memories generated fear where none previously existed. Oh, God. Marcus choked Emma out. They are still doing this to Emma. We are going to stop them, Alexander promised. But we need your help. Glenn moved forward with precision, demonstrating his military expertise. Marcus, the question we're about to ask you is tough and even hazardous. You'll have to pretend everything is normal while we gather evidence. Can you do that? Marcus wiped his eyes and straightened in his chair. In that moment, he appeared less like a perplexed 15-year-old and more like the man he was becoming. What do you need me to do? Glenn's subterranean command center was buzzing with activity. New monitors had been added, each exhibiting a distinct part of the operation. One showed a live feed from Rick's Lake Cottage. Another monitored financial transactions across numerous accounts, while a third showed a complex sequence of events. Glenn indicated that your cancer had worsened, according to the most recent medical report that they had carefully doctored. According to this, the treatment isn't as effective as expected. The prognosis is 3 months, possibly less. Alexander reviewed the report. They will want to confirm this. Sylvia intervened after the situation had already been resolved. She'd been practically living in Glenn's office for the previous week. I have a contact in the hospital records. The information is in the system, if they check their checks. Marcus affirmed from his position in front of one of the monitors. He was astonishingly good at surveillance work, his youthful technological prowess complementing Glenn's instruction. Mom just visited the hospital portal using her phone. The wait was awful. Alexander forced himself to breathe, gradually overcoming both the side effects of his most recent treatment and the tension of waiting. Finally, Marcus's phone was busted. She's calling Rick. He reported placing the phone on speaker. Tracy's voice filled the entire room. Have you seen it? A new prognosis. I saw it. Rick's voice had an edge of eagerness that was badly disguised as concern. We need to move quicker. How are the offshore accounts? Almost ready. But, Rick, the youngsters stick to their strategy. Tracy, once we have the insurance money and the company's assets, we'll be good for life. The kids would just complicate matters. Marcus's hands tightened into fists, but he kept his cool. Exactly as Glenn had taught him. Alexander felt a thrill of pride, despite his fury. Tracy and Rick had no idea their son was this strong. Over the next week, they watched Tracy and Rick speed up their plans. Company assets began to vanish, transferred through a complicated web of sham corporations. Insurance documents were updated. New accounts appeared at banks recognized for their prudence when managing large transactions. Sylvia noticed as she reviewed the most recent financial documents that they were becoming increasingly sloppy, making blunders in a rush. Good, Glenn responded. He turned to face Alexander. It's time to call in my FBI contacts. We have enough evidence now. Financial fraud, psychological abuse, and conspiracy. They will want to move rapidly. Alexander nodded and then looked at Marcus. Are you ready for what's next? Once we enlist the FBI, there is no turning back. Marcus looked at the monitor, which showed Emma in her room completing schoolwork, unconscious of what was going to happen around her. I am ready. Emma deserves to know the truth. He swallowed hard. Mom and Rick must pay for what they have done. Glenn placed the call. Within hours, his basement office was crowded with federal agents, each tasked with a specific aspect of the operation. They moved quietly, documenting transactions, analyzing recordings, and putting together their case. One agent calmly stated to Marcus that they would eventually need your sister's testimony, but not until she is ready. Dr. McPherson will assist with that. The parts were falling into place. Tracy and Rick's carefully woven web of deceit was about to unravel, but Alexander felt no satisfaction, only tremendous regret for his children and all they had been through. Dad? Marcus' voice pulled him out of his thoughts. What happens after this is over? Alexander drew his son closer, his heart aching from how long it had been since he'd been able to provide such comfort. We reconstruct every memory they took and every lie they uttered. We replace it with the truth. And this time, we're building on solid ground. The monitors maintained their silent vigil, capturing Tracy and Rick's every move, conversation, and attempt to destroy a family for profit. They had misjudged the power of genuine family relationships, the durability of truth, and the tenacity of a father's love. The end game was nearing, and this time Alexander had all the cards. The waiting room at the family therapy center smelled like artificial lavender and broken promises. Tracy sat primly on the beige sofa, her manicured nails tapped against her fancy purse. Rick stood beside the window, his confidence clear in his posture. Neither saw the tiny protrusion behind the receptionist's desk, where surveillance equipment had been discreetly put the night prior. Emma sat on the edge of her chair, black lines beneath her eyes, revealing nights of restless sleep. Marcus sat next to her, his hand periodically brushing across the recording device Glenn had hidden in his jacket pocket. The weight felt like armor. "Remember what we practiced?" Tracy murmured to Emma, her voice plainly audible over the hidden mics. "Dr. Patterson needs to hear the incidents clearly." Tracy had no idea that Dr. Patterson had called in ill that morning instead of him. Dr. Claire McPherson sat in the consultation room with Alexander and the FBI investigators, discussing the remaining pieces of evidence. "They are all here," the receptionist verified using her earpiece. Claire nodded at Alexander. "Are you ready?" Alexander adjusted the collar of his shirt to conceal the medical port underneath. The most recent round of chemotherapy had made him weaker, but determination remained in his eyes. "I've been ready since I saw Tracy's phone message," the receptionist's voice crackled across the waiting room speaker. "The doctor will see you right immediately." Tracy stood and smoothed her clothing. "Come on, youngsters, remember that honesty is crucial." Marcus grabbed his hand as they proceeded to the consultation room. She squeezed back, not understanding why her brother's palm was so sweaty. The consulting room door opened to reveal a large group of police enforcement officers, child protective services workers, and Dr. Claire McPherson, rather than the elderly Dr. Patterson. Alexander sat in a chair near the enormous screen on the wall. Glenn stood like a sentinel beside him. "What's this?" Tracy's composure snapped. "Where is Dr. Patterson?" "Please, everyone, take your seat," Claire said, her professional demeanor allowing no disagreement. "We have some recordings to review." Rick approached the door, but an FBI agent barred his route. "Mr. Nunez, this is a closed session." The enormous screen sprung to life. Tracy and Rick were teaching Emma through her abuse memories in the first shot, which was taken at his lake cottage. Emma's cheeks drained of color as she witnessed herself being twisted. I saw how they carefully planted suggestions and warped her memories. "That's not right," Emma's voice quivered. "You mentioned these were therapy sessions." "Continue to watch," Marcus whispered. The following film showed Tracy and Rick in what they thought was a quiet time, discussing their plans. "We'll disappear after we've received the insurance money and testimony." Rick's voice filled the entire room. The kids would merely complicate matters. They're old enough to go their own way. "What if they try to find us?" Tracy asked. "They will not. Not after we've convinced kids their father was a monster. Besides, who would believe them with all of the reported abuse?" Emma's world tilted. She glanced to her mother, hoping for denial or explanation, but Tracy's face had hardened into a mask of cold calculating. "Were you going to abandon us?" Emma's voice crackled. "Everything you told me about Dad was a lie. Emma, honey, you do not understand." Tracy reached for her daughter, but Emma retreated. "Do not touch me." The teenager's legs went way, and she would have fallen if Alexander hadn't intervened to save her father. "I'm so sorry. I honestly thought they made me believe." Alexander embraced his daughter as she let go of years of contrived anxieties and false memories, which crumbled in the face of undisputed truth. Marcus hurried to join them and formed a protective circle around his sister. Rick made another attempt toward the door, but Glenn stood in his way. "Going somewhere? We have not even gotten to the financial proof yet." Claire gestured at the FBI agents. "I believe you have some questions for Miss Payne and Mr. Nunez as the agents begin reading the Miranda rights." Emma hugged her father, tears dripping onto his shirt. "How can I believe any of my recollections now? How can I know what is real?" "We'll sort things out together," Alexander assured as he stroked her hair. That is what family actually means. Not manipulation or lies, but standing together in the face of adversity and assisting one another in healing. Tracy's mask shattered when the handcuffs clicked around her wrists. "Emma, Marcus, please. You need to understand that I was attempting to protect you." "What source?" Marcus's voice held all the derision of his 15-year-old father, who taught me how to make things, attended every baseball game, and never raised his voice, let alone his hand. Emma spoke quietly. "The only monsters here are you and Rick." The courthouse hallway resounded with footfall and murmured discussions. Alexander sat on a wooden bench outside the courtroom, with his children encircling him like honor guards. The chemotherapy had removed his hair, but not his pride. If anything, his disappearance highlighted the stark difference between reality and Tracy's fabricated allegations of abuse. Sylvia approached her trial notes, which were organized in her signature leather briefcase. "The jury is coming back." That was quick. "Only 4 hours of deliberation. Is this good or bad?" Emma tightened the friendship bracelet around her wrist, an anxious habit she acquired during the trial. "This is a complicated case." Sylvia's lips curved into a contented smile. "It is very good." This suggests that the evidence was overwhelming. They filed back into the courtroom. Tracy and Rick sat at different tables with their attorneys. Both appear significantly less polished after 3 months in county jail. The evidence against them was too strong for bail. The jury filed in none while maintaining eye contact with the defendants. The foreman handed over the verdict documents to the bailiff, who delivered them to Judge Marion Wheeler. The judge's face remained expressionless as she reviewed the paperwork. "Will the defendants please rise?" Tracy stood in her orange jumpsuit, which was a far cry from her typical fashionable wardrobe. Rick's confident sneer had finally shattered, revealing the despair behind. "On the charge of conspiracy to commit fraud." "How do you determine guilt, Your Honor?" "On the charge of attempted grand larceny." "Guilty, Your Honor." The verdicts proceeded. "Guilty of child psychological abuse. I am guilty of embezzlement. Guilty on all charges. Emma clasped Alexander's hand with each announcement, while Marcus sat upright and supported his expression. Stern. Judge Wheeler set aside the verdict documents before I proceed with the sentencing. I'd like to address something special about this case. She glanced directly at Tracy and Rick. In my 30 years on the bench, I've witnessed numerous financial crimes. I've witnessed theft, fraud, and embezzlement. However, what you two attempted goes beyond simple stealing of money. You attempted to steal the children's love for their father. You aimed to undermine the very base of their reality, their ability to believe their own recollections and experiences. This is an unforgivable crime. The judge adjusted her glasses. Mr. Nunez, based on your prior history of similar schemes in 3 other jurisdictions, I sentence you to 25 years in state prison. Miss Payne, you were condemned to 15 years. She stopped, her expression hardening. And let me be clear, these sentences will be served consecutively, not concurrently. There will be no option for an early release. Tracy fell in her chair, Rick's mask shattered as the bailiffs approached to lead them out. Emma? Marcus! Tracy called out. Please do not let it finish like way. But her children had already turned aside, following their father out of the courtroom and into the hallway. They discovered Glenn and Claire waiting. It is over. Glenn spoke plainly. Claire corrected gently. Now, the real job begins. Healing, rebuilding trust, recreating true memories to replace fabricated ones. Alexander cuddled his children closely. Whatever it takes, however long it takes, we will complete it together. 6 months after the experiment, Alexander stood in Metro General Hospital's cancer ward, his hand hovering over the brass bell that patients rang at the end of their treatments. The most recent tests verified what his body had already begun to tell him. The cancer was in remission. Ring it, Dad. Marcus called from where he and Emma stood, both teenagers beaming with pride. Alexander clutched the bell's cord, and its clear tone echoed across the ward. Medical personnel emerged from various entrances to cheer. Many of them had been with him during the toughest days of his therapy. Dr. Jonathan Griffith approached from the crowd and drew Alexander into a kind hug. When you originally came in with that cough, I had no idea we'd be waging 2 battles at once. 3 battles? Emma corrected, entering the embrace, cancer, and treachery in our minds. She had been working with Claire twice a week, slowly separating the web of fake memories from her genuine ones. Claire spoke of minds as she appeared with a stack of journals under her arm. Marcus, I have your new writing prompts ready. Yours centers on early baseball recollections. Emma. We're going to work on the art class memories you shared last session. The teens took their diaries without complaining. The writing assignments had become an important component of their therapy, allowing them to enhance actual memories while identifying and processing created ones. Glenn is waiting at the house, Marcus reminded them. He is grilling steaks to celebrate. The drive home took them past their former neighborhood, but Alexander felt no desire to return to the house he once shared with Tracy. Instead, he turned to the new development, where they'd started over. He designed the home himself, with participation from both children. Glenn stood at the grill on their back terrace. The smell of well-cooked beef permeates the air. The former Marine had gotten so familiar to the neighbors that they mistook him for a cousin. Perfect timing, he said, turning a steak. Emma, the potatoes you prepared are ready to go into the oven. Alexander paid close attention to his children as they sat at the outdoor table. Emma no longer startled at abrupt movements, and Marcus had stopped obsessively checking his phone for messages from Tracy. They were all recovering in different ways. I've been thinking, Emma explained, pushing her vegetables around her plate. I want to return to the community center and possibly volunteer with the art class again. Alexander understood what this meant. Tracy began planting false memories about his behavior in MSR classes at the community center. Returning there was more than just volunteering. It was about recovering her space, her actual memories. "I will go with you," Marcus offered. "They probably need assistance with the Little League program anyway." Claire nodded in approval. "That is excellent improvement. Remember what we were talking about? Replacing negative associations with new, pleasant ones." Glenn lifted a glass to new experiences. Then on to family. The actual sort. Founded on truth and confidence in Father, Emma added, her eyes gleaming as she fought for us even when we didn't realize we needed it. Later that evening, Alexander stood by his bedroom window, watching Emma and Marcus play basketball in the driveway. Their genuine and unadulterated laughter echoed through the oncoming dusk. The shadows were vanished, replaced by the warm warmth of genuine connection. On his dresser, 3 artifacts sat in a row: a brass bell from the cancer hospital, a family photo taken at the courthouse following the decision, and a little construction level, which he determined would be their family's new symbol, a reminder that with the appropriate foundation and diligent workmanship, anything may be built straight and true. Even a destroyed family can be repaired, one true recollection at a time. Epilogue. 10 years later, the autumn breeze carried the aroma of freshly brewed coffee from Alexander Lee's new workplace, a huge space behind his renovated construction firm headquarters. At age 55, his hair has regrown silver after chemotherapy, matching the distinctive lines surrounding his eyes. The previous decade had left its imprint, but they were medals of survival rather than scars of defeat. Dad. The Mitchell Project drawings are ready for approval. Emma's voice rang from the workplace at 27. She had followed in her father's footsteps, obtaining an architectural degree and entering the family firm. Her designs had already received several sustainable construction honors, providing a new viewpoint to Lee Construction's portfolio. Alexander grinned, thinking how far they had come. The same hands that had shook while clutching Tracy's phone were now steadily guiding their company toward new horizons. The company had not only recovered from Rick's embezzlement, but had grown stronger, with Marcus handling the finance side after earning his MBA. No contract or transaction was signed without the approval of multiple parties. Reviewing the specifics. A lesson learned at an excessive expense. Direct them to the conference room. He called back. Glenn is also coming to see them. Glenn Massey, now completely gray, but yet with his military bearing, had remained an important part of their lives. His security consulting firm was located in the building's east wing, and he had become the children's only uncle figure. His marriage to Claire McPherson 3 years earlier had only legalized what they all knew. Adversity had strengthened their odd familial bond. Marcus came, bearing fresh coffee and slung his business jacket over one arm. At 25, he had evolved into a savvy businessman with a firm moral compass. He said he had just received the Victim Restitution Program's quarterly update, setting down the cups. 2 more of Rick's former victims have received full compensation. Marcus had initiated the program, after discovering more of Rick's former victims in various states. He had set up a fund to help them regain their losses. It was his attempt to convert their family's trauma into something constructive. "Is there any word from the parole board?" Glenn inquired, entering with a tablet under his arm. Alexander shakes his head. Tracy's 3rd appeal was refused this month. The claims of psychological abuse were particularly persistent. Claire's testimony made certain of that. The mention of Tracy brought a familiar weight into the atmosphere. She had served 8 years of her 15-year sentence while claiming her innocence despite overwhelming evidence. Her letters to the children came to an end after year 5, when neither Emma nor Marcus received a response. She gained a reputation at the women's jail facility for manipulating younger inmates, which led to her losing privileges and being transferred to a higher security section. Rick's fate had been far more dismal. His 25-year sentence was extended as he attempted to operate another operation from within the prison, tricking a guard's wife into transporting contraband. The additional charges essentially ensured he would spend the remainder of his life in prison. "I saw her last week," Emma murmured gently as she entered with the project files. The entire room fell silent. Everyone knew who she was talking about. In the grocery store of all places. "Remember Mrs. Henderson? She used to play bridge with her mom." Alexander nodded. Tracy had used the bridge club as one of her hunting grounds, spreading the first whispered rumors about Alexander's fury. Emma continued, laying the designs across the conference table, not looking me in the eye. "Neither of them can anymore. Not after all was revealed in the trial. You are aware that the bridge club as a whole has dissolved. Nobody trusted one another. After understanding, they'd all been used to back up Mom's bogus claims." Claire came as Emma was speaking, her therapist's insight sharper than ever despite her semi-retirement. She had become a prominent expert in fake memory implantation cases and was now entirely focused on them. Her paper on the Lee case, with the family's permission and identities changed, was now required reading in several psychology departments. "How did you feel when you saw her?" Claire inquired, slipping into her usual chair. Emma's hands traced the lines of her latest work while she thought about the sad question. Mostly not for her, but for who I assumed she was. "I recall my mother from my early youth. I'm still not sure how much of that was real and how much was manipulation. Good memories can be genuine, even if the person who helped create them is dishonest," Claire reminded her gently. They created a therapeutic principle together over the course of several years of meetings. Marcus loosened his tie in a gesture reminiscent of his teenage years. "I received another letter from Rick last week. He is still claiming that his mother misled him and that he lost himself in her ruse." He shakes his head. "The detectives discovered his previous cases, along with those of 3 other families who came before us. He was always the architect and not the victim." Glenn interjected, sensing the need to change the topic. "Show me the new designs, Emma. The sustainable materials program you proposed is just what the city contract requires." As Emma began her presentation, Alexander looked at his family, the one he had worked so hard to save and the one that had evolved beyond blood ties. Glenn and Claire sat close together, their shoulders touching, as Marcus took notes with the same zeal he'd once brought to baseball. Each of them had scars from the trauma, but they'd learned to wear them with dignity. The workshop windows provided a view of the memorial garden they had created 5 years earlier to honor victims of psychological torture. Emma had devised a plan to turn their suffering into purpose. The garden had become a haven for other families seeking healing after similar betrayals. Its paths are lined with plaques that provide resources and hope. Claire's therapy groups would often gather there, sitting among the flowers and exchanging their tales. Some days, Alexander would record snippets of their chats. Tales of treachery, deception, and final success mirrored his own trajectory. Each narrative reinforced what he'd learned. The greatest wins were frequently camouflaged as defeats, and the deepest wounds might become sources of power. A young woman exited from one such group session, wiping away tears. Alexander recognized her. The daughter of one of Rick's prior victims is only now attempting to unravel the web of deceit that trapped her family 15 years ago. Marcus found her while researching the reparations scheme. She yelled out, Mr. Lee, when she saw him through the window. I would like to thank you. What your family did. Exposing them. Establishing a support network. It helped me realize what had happened to my mother. Alexander invited her in and introduced her to the others while she told her story. He noticed Emma and Marcus exchange glances. Her remarks reminded them of their own past grief, as well as the promise of healing. You know, Glenn commented later when they closed up for the day, when I first placed the monitoring cameras at Rick's lake house, I had no idea we'd wind up here, running a construction enterprise, hosting therapy sessions, and transforming people's lives. Life is funny that way, Alexander said, inspecting the security system, a habit he'd never broken. Sometimes the biggest betrayals lead us to our real path. The setting light spreads lengthy shadows around the workshop, but unlike previous shadows, these were clean and honest. They stretched toward the garden, where new flowers were always sprouting, symbolizing the hope that had grown from their worst experiences. Later that evening, they reassembled at Alexander's house, continuing a custom that had weathered every storm. Claire brought her trademark lasagna. Glenn poured his famed mojitos with virgin versions for the younger members of their extended family, while Emma's teenage daughter Sophie practiced card tricks she'd learnt at school. Sophie, born 3 years after the trial, embodied all they had battled for. A new generation is growing up surrounded by genuine love and honest recollections. She understood the family history had been told in an age-appropriate manner, but to her, it felt like a narrative from another world. Her world was filled with Sunday dinners, family game nights, and the unconditional affection of a father, uncle, and grandparents who had learned the genuine meaning of family through hard experience. As Alexander watched Sophie deal cards with the same determined face Marcus used to have at baseball games, he realized they had won. Not the prison sentences, the recovered assets, or even the professional accomplishments. But this is the basic ability to produce true memories free of manipulation and deception. Tracy and Rick attempted to destroy his family through fake memories. But in doing so, they taught them all the immense worth of truth. Their betrayal had compelled Alexander to battle not only for his survival, but for the very essence of family. Love. In winning that war, he and his children created something far stronger than what they had lost. A legacy of honesty, resilience, and unwavering support that would endure for decades. The night concluded as it always did, with everyone helping to clean up and making preparations for next week's meal, sharing the minute nuances that comprise a real family's life. There is no manipulation, no hidden motive, just the basic truth of people who had chosen to confront life's hardships together as the last automobile drove away. Alexander stood in his doorway, inhaling the night air. Somewhere in a jail cell, Tracy and Rick were dealing with the consequences of their decisions. However, they attempted to ruin my home and family. Life grew again, demonstrating that the strongest foundations are built not on lies, but on unshakable love and truth. He closed the door, set an alarm. Old traditions die hard, and he grinned at the family portraits that lined his hallway. Each one told a narrative about healing, rejuvenation, and the kind of love that only gets stronger when tested by fire. The shadows had long vanished, and in their place a legacy of truth continued to bloom, season after season, year after year. Here's the next story. I told him that he was a weak man and should observe me doing it with his friend. He rose up and read it. First and foremost, this is not my first time posting here, but I'm using a throwaway account since I don't want this associated with my primary. You understand how it feels to open up about your personal life. There is no reason for everyone to connect the connections for the sake of privacy. I'll call myself Emma and my hubby Ray. So, a little background. I am 29 years old, and Ray, my spouse, is 28. We've known one another for what seems like forever since high school. We met when I was 17 and he was 16, and there was an immediate connection. People often say love at first sight. For Ray, it was just that. He fell head over heels for me from the moment we met. Honestly, it was a little overwhelming at first. He glanced at me and hung on every word I said. But I gradually developed feelings for him as well. We've been together ever since. We dated throughout high school and into college. It was never an issue of us breaking up or growing apart, as you hear about in other marriages. We had always known we were meant to be together. Everyone referred to us as the couple. You know, the ones everyone assumes will marry and have children. The entire thing. And they were not wrong. Ray proposed to me approximately 3 years ago, and we married 2 years ago. Since then, things has been nice. At least I thought so. Ray has always been the romantic partner in our relationship. He's the man who brings home flowers at random, the one that organizes date nights and often asks if I need anything, whether it's a cup of coffee in the morning or someone to lean on when times are difficult. He's the type of husband that is always available, and I've never had to worry about him not turning up for me. He adores me, and I am fully aware of this. Ray is the type of man that will go above and above for me without hesitation. I am serious. He would not even hesitate, whether it's something minor, such as changing plans at the last minute because I don't feel like going out, or something more significant. For example, you could work more hours to pay for your trip. I wanted. He's always been the one making the sacrifices in this relationship, and I've always been fine with it. Here's the problem, though. I'm not really romantic. Sure, I love him, but I've always been the more laid-back one in our relationship. Ray is the one who makes huge gestures, and I've never felt the need to match his level of effort. He does it just because he loves me, and I appreciate it. I've never had to work hard to make him happy or feel special since he always does it for both of us. I'm a stay-at-home wife, which Ray and I agreed to when we married. I understand that some individuals may object, but it is effective for us. Ray has always worked hard and has provided for us since the beginning. He enjoys his profession and is glad to be the breadwinner. I, on the other hand, am responsible for the house and all of its contents. To be honest, I've been completely satisfied with how things have turned out. I get to enjoy a luxurious life, while Ray gets to play the role. He has always enjoyed being a provider and protector. However, I must admit that I may have taken that for granted at times. Ray has always been a touch too weak, in my opinion. I know that seems harsh, but to be honest, that is how I have always perceived him. He's not your average guy, you know. Not the type of man to command a room or exude confidence. He's never been the sort to take charge or defend himself, at least not in the way I'd expect from a typical man. Ray. That's something I've seen more since we got married. When we initially met, I thought it was nice that he was more of a nerd. He was not like the jocks or bad boys. Most girls swoon. Ray was not like everyone else. He was gentle, calm, and caring. However, as time passed, that softness began to feel less like a great feature and more like a weakness. To be honest, I'm not trying to put him down. I understand it sounds horrible, but it is the truth. Ray has always preferred comic books, video games, and board games with his buddies over anything else. He's the type of guy who would rather spend his Saturday night watching a new Marvel film than going out to party or doing anything more manly or daring. He's not the sort to get his hands filthy with car maintenance or hang out with a large group of buddies who make him the life of the party. He's a loner, a little introverted, and more interested in technology and gadgets than sports or other usual male activities. And that's fine. I suppose it's just who he is. However, as our marriage progressed, I became increasingly dissatisfied with it. It was as if I wanted him to be stronger, to have a little more edge. I wanted him to be more assertive, to take control of things on occasion, but that was not who he was. Ray has always been more of a people pleaser, particularly with me. He never wanted to quarrel or push back, even when I was being unreasonable. He'd always agree with anything I said, hoping to make me happy. After a while, I believe I began to perceive that as a weakness. He was unlike other males. I noticed those who could stand their ground or handle situations with a little more tenacity. Instead, he was an exceedingly accommodating, soft-hearted guy who was always concerned with my well-being. Maybe it's because of that. I got into the habit of teasing him for it. Initially, it was unintentional. It began as a harmless taunting, making fun of him for spending hours setting up Dungeons and Dragons campaigns with his pals, or dubbing him a nerd when he became overly enthused about some new electronic item he purchased. I assumed it was harmless, just some light banter amongst us. But looking back, I can understand how the teasing evolved into something more toxic. I began making increasingly subtle jabs at him, both privately and in public. It became a habit. For example, if he couldn't open a jar or anything broke around the house, I'd laugh and say something like, "Oh, don't worry, I'll fix it. Since you are not Mr. Fix-It, are you?" Or if he was hesitant to make a decision, I would roll my eyes and say, "Come on, Ray. You are such a pushover. Sometimes." I didn't mean it hurtfully, or at least I didn't believe I did at the time. But as I said it, I realized it was undermining his confidence, little by little. What is the worst part? I wasn't simply doing it in private. I started making fun of him in front of our friends. If we were hanging out and someone mentioned something physical, such as sports or car repairs, I respond with something like, "Yeah, Ray wouldn't know the first thing about that," and laugh it off as if it were no great issue. The thing is, Ray would just chuckle along as if it didn't upset him, but I could tell in his eyes. It bothered him. It harmed him. But I did not stop. In a strange way, I thought it was okay since he loved me so much. I honestly didn't believe it would drive him away. I assumed he'd never leave me, regardless of what I said or did. He was so in love with me that he'd just accept it. I was the one with the power in our relationship, and I knew it. Ray was always going out of his way to make me happy. And I suppose I became a bit too comfortable with that. It's not like I was intentionally harsh to him. I didn't think so at the time, but I see now that I wasn't the best partner either. I was poking at his vulnerabilities on a regular basis. So it became second nature to me. I stopped seeing him as a strong, capable man, and instead regarded him as someone who was always available to meet my demands. And that is something I took advantage of. Looking back, I see I've been pushing him down for years. And at the time, I assumed he'd keep taking it because he loved me. But, well, I suppose love has its limitations. Honestly, I'm amazed Ray didn't tire of me sooner. Looking back, I see how much I shit on him for almost everything. And when I say everything, I truly mean it. Nothing was off limits. His sensitivity, the way he worried about his job, his physical appearance, his interests, and his hobbies were all fair game for me to insult. I'd pick on him for being overly sensitive, always fast to become emotional or agitated out over minor issues. I'd say things like, "God, Ray, why are you always so dramatic? Or do you worry too much? Just man up." His employment was another thing I would continually blame him for. He works in cybersecurity, which I suppose is a very legitimate profession. But it's not the type of job you'd expect from a manly man, if you know what I mean. He would occasionally discuss how difficult things were at work, or how concerned he was about his company's reorganization or layoffs. And instead of encouraging him, I ignore his concerns. urging him to quit complaining or make snarky remarks like, "Oh, poor Ray is stressed out because of his computer job. It must be quite difficult to sit at a desk all day." Then there were his physical insecurities. Ray has always been on the thinner side. Not exactly the muscular and athletic kind. I don't mind it today, but at some time, I started using it as ammunition as well. I'd make little jokes about how he wasn't as strong as other guys, or how he'd never be able to lift me if I fell. I once suggested that you go to the gym with Mike. He might be able to teach you a thing or two about how to appear manly. I said this in front of Mike, by the way. Ray's pal, who has the build of a linebacker. Ray simply laughed it off at the moment, but I knew it hurt. I was always taunting him about his likes and interests. Ray's hobbies, I suppose, are somewhat geeky. He enjoys gaming, reading fantasy novels, watching anime, and, of course, playing Dungeons and Dragons with his pals. I never had an issue with that when we first met. However, as time passed, I became increasingly disturbed by his enthusiasm. It was not macho in the classic sense. It wasn't the kind of thing a guy would obsess over. I began making fun of it more and more every time he mentioned a new game or an episode he had seen. I'd roll my eyes and say, "Oops, here we go again, nerd alert." Or, "Why don't you grow up and do something worthwhile for once?" He would simply laugh it off, as he always did. But I knew I was cutting deep. I could see it on his face. He'd shrink a little if I said something, but he didn't fight back. He simply took it. What made matters worse was how I handled it. Everywhere, literally everywhere. I didn't merely hide these jabs and insults behind closed doors. No, I did it in front of his friends, my friends, at social gatherings, parties, and anywhere. I had a bad habit of publicly embarrassing him, which I wasn't even conscious of at the time. I thought I was being amusing or sarcastic, but it was cruel. And there were many instances when we'd be out with friends and I'd say something like, "Oh, Ray, he doesn't even know how to change a tire. Last time I had to contact for roadside help." Or yes, Ray would crumble if he had to cope with the pressure your spouse does. "Sarah, you're so fortunate to have a real man at home. The worst part is that I'd say these things to my girlfriends in front of Ray without blinking an eye. I didn't think about how awful it must have been for him to sit there and be compared to other males. Guys that I consider to be more macho or capable." Ray certainly noticed. He noticed. I could see it on his face every time I said something to bring him down. But, as always, he said nothing. He'd just sit there, smile sweetly, and chuckle as if it didn't hurt. But it did. I could see it. And yet, I continued doing it. At the time, I didn't give it much thought. In my view, I was simply taunting him. But now I know I was continuously disparaging him. Whether it was intended or not, I thought I had Ray wrapped around my finger. I never anticipated he'd leave or become fed up with me. I assumed his love for me would always be enough to keep him around, no matter how hard I pushed or humiliated him. I assumed, hey, he loves me, right? He will take whatever I throw at him because he is too weak to abandon me. But I was mistaken. I'm still surprised that he lasted as long as he did, given how frequently I tore him down. What type of person would do that to someone they care so deeply about, someone who is willing to do everything for them? But I believe, in my mind, I convinced myself that it was fine since I didn't think Ray was strong enough to leave me. I assumed his frailty would keep him by my side indefinitely. I began to notice Ray acting distant. Initially, it was tiny, minor details that I overlooked. He wasn't as talkative as he once was, and when we were at home together, he appeared distracted. He would sit on his phone more frequently, scroll through social media, or watch videos, and I rarely engage in conversation unless I initiate it. I remember assuming it was simply work, stress, or something going on with his pals that he didn't want to talk about. But as time went on, it became clear that something was wrong. Ray started arriving home later as usual. When he arrived home, he would give me a short kiss, claim he was weary, and then go directly to the shower or bed. We used to have lengthy discussions after work, discuss our days, and even sit down to watch a show or two together. It seemed like he was making excuses to avoid spending time with me. He'd explain he was fatigued or had late-night work to catch up on, and I'd just shrug it off. At the time, I didn't think much of it. I couldn't believe Ray, the man who had always loved me so much, would intentionally shun me. The concept of his purposefully separating himself from me was so strange to me that I didn't consider it. After all, this was Ray, the guy who had been crushing on me since high school, the one who will go to any length to help me. So, rather of thinking that we had a problem, I reasoned that it must be something else. Perhaps he was going through a difficult time at work, or he was stressed about something he didn't want to discuss. I never considered that I could be the cause of his sudden change in conduct. In truth, I gave it very little thought. I figured he'd tell me when he was ready. Ray wasn't the type to keep secrets from me, at least not that I knew. So I left it at that. Didn't push or ask too many questions. I felt confident that whatever was going on wasn't about us. It could not be. Ray was in love with me too much, and I had no doubt that he would never separate himself from me. It was almost as if I was completely confident in our connection. I convinced myself that no matter what I said or did, Ray would be waiting for me with open arms. So, even as he became increasingly aloof, I failed to see the pattern. I didn't believe it had anything to do with how I treated him or the frequent ridiculing. That was not even an option in my thinking. In fact, when I sensed he was aloof, I would tease him with remarks like, "What's wrong, Ray? Are you not falling out of love with me? Or perhaps you've been unusually quiet recently. Don't tell me you have another woman." Of course, I said everything in a joking tone. I had no idea how disconnected I was from what was actually going on. Looking back, it's brutally clear that Ray went out of his way to avoid me. He was not simply weary or anxious. He was bored of me. Small flaws in our relationship were beginning to show, but I didn't notice them. I didn't notice the indicators that he was backing away since I thought I was still in control. I assumed that no matter how much I derided or belittled him, Ray would never abandon me or even consider putting distance between us. And this is where I went so wrong. I underestimated him. I miscalculated his power, emotions, and how much my actions were affecting him. But I wasn't aware of any of this at the time. I was too caught up in my own world to be certain of my power over him. Imagine Ray, my beautiful, faithful Ray, sliding away from me. So, rather than confront it or try to figure out what was going on, I simply ignored it. I figured everything would return to normal on its own, and whatever was hurting him would pass. I thought it was Ray. He has always been there and will continue to be. I had no concept that his distance was a red flag that things were about to collapse. By the time I recognized it, it was too late. Everything came to a head over a friend's birthday party. It began like any other celebration. Wonderful food, beverages, laughs, and everyone in great spirits. After the official party concluded, a few of us decided to extend the night by going to a bar for additional drinks. Ray and I were there with a couple of our close friends, and as usual, we had a few too many drinks. I dropped my guard and began to speak freely. You understand how booze works. It accentuates everything, including my predisposition to insult Ray. I started laying into him as I always did, without thinking twice. At first, it was just fun digs, and I would joke with my friends about Ray's sensitivity and nerdiness. They also laughed, most likely because they weren't sure what else to do. But I didn't care. I kept going, allowing the booze to soften my tongue. I told them, partly kidding, half serious, that Ray was so weak that he would do nothing if he discovered me with another man. I said Ray is the type of man who would probably simply sit in the corner and do nothing. I didn't notice how quiet he'd become while sitting in the booth, staring into his glass. I was too focused on obtaining attention and cheap chuckles from my friends. They laughed awkwardly. I didn't stop, even though it was probably uncomfortable. I kept criticizing him, calling him weak, and claiming that he was not like the other men in our company. He was not manly enough, not in the usual sense. Ray suddenly stood up, and I will never forget the expression on his face. It was not the gentle, adoring expression I had gotten accustomed to over the years. It was a combination of rage and tiredness, as if he had been holding back for too long and had finally reached his breaking point. When he instructed me to stop talking, his voice sliced through the bar's commotion. I recall freezing in my seat, my smile disappearing abruptly. I'd never heard him speak to me like way. It was so out of character for him to raise his voice, and for a while I thought he was simply playing me. Then he said it. He was finished with me. He stated he couldn't take my incessant taunting longer, that he was tired of being humiliated and dismissed. He said it was pathetic that I called him weak, while I was the one who relied on him for everything. His voice was firm and full of conviction, and it struck me like a slap in the face. I could feel our friends' eyes on me, and the air around us became heavy with tension. Nobody said anything as Ray continued to tell me that he wanted a divorce. He had had enough of being treated as if he were nothing. I was too astonished to answer. I sat there speechless as he walked out of the bar. But before he went, he turned around, reached into his pocket, and took out a crumpled set of divorce papers. Divorce papers? I had no idea they existed, let alone that they had been sitting in our car all night. He threw them on the table in front of me and walked away without speaking, leaving me stunned. It was as though someone had flipped a switch. The laughing that had filled the night had vanished, and I was suddenly brought back to reality. I could feel the uneasiness creeping over the table, and the stillness stretched on for what seemed like hours. My companions were silent. No one knew what to say or how to react. I wasn't sure what to say either. I'd never seen Ray like that before. So forceful and so decisive. I had always assumed he was too weak to stand up to me. I'm too in love with you to ever leave. But here he was, strolling out of my life, as if he'd planned it for a long time. I tried calling him just after he left, fumbling with my phone. He did not pick up. I tried several times, but each time it went directly to voicemail. That's when I realized he was serious. Dead serious. I didn't know what else to do, so I got an Uber and sat in the back seat the entire way home, repeating everything in my thoughts and attempting to find out where it all went wrong. It felt as if the ground had just collapsed beneath me. When I returned home, things had gotten considerably worse. My belongings, including clothes, shoes, and bags, were all on the porch. I could not believe it. Ray had literally tossed my belongings out of the house. He had bolted the door, and no matter how hard I hammered on it or how many times I called his name, he refused to open up. I knew he was inside. I could see the light through the windows, but he did not react. It was as if I no longer existed for him. I was stranded. I had nowhere else to go. He'd even wiped out our joint account, leaving me with nothing. The money I spent on the Uber was my last chunk of cash. I had to phone my best friend, crying and pleading her to let me remain at her home. She consented, of course, but I could see she was as surprised as I was. Ray had always been the trustworthy person. He would never do something like this. But it felt as if he had become a stranger overnight. It's been days, and he still won't speak to me. I've sent him text after text, begging him to forgive me or at least talk to me so we can work things out. I've apologized repeatedly, but he hasn't responded to any of my messages. I'm totally lost. I do not know what to do. I never imagined Ray would leave me. I never thought he was capable of walking away, and now I'm stranded here alone, unsure what to do next. Update? Hello, Reddit. Wow. The heat. A lot of people are telling me that I screwed around and found out, which is honestly very annoying right now. Like, yes, I understand that. I am aware that I made a mistake. Yes, I fooled around, and I did find out. Nobody knows that better than I do right now. But can we please get past that? I came here really seeking advice on how to avoid being laughed into obscurity. I recognize that I am at fault. I realize that I made a huge mistake. But I didn't come here to be burned. I came because I needed practical guidance that could help me save my relationship and marriage before it was too late. Because my spouse is truly on the verge of divorcing me, and I don't know what else to do. I have tried everything I can think of. I've apologized more than I can count. Yet it doesn't appear to be enough. My best friend has spoken to me. My parents have been interested. Even his parents, though they appeared far too pleased that Ray was divorcing me. They were not exactly eager to assist, if you get what I mean. It's almost as if they were waiting for this to happen. Anyway, I tried to chat to Ray. I eventually got him to sit down and have a chat with me, but he's not prepared to compromise on anything. He told me straight out that he wants a divorce and nothing will change his mind. I could bring in the Pope and the Vatican. Hell, I could resuscitate a saint, and he'd never change his mind. I believe he even made a joke about it, which made me feel much worse. How can I remedy this when he is so stubborn? It's as if this entire problem started with something I thought was a joke, something he had previously asterisked. I'm really upset and frustrated that things have gotten to this point. I never imagined Ray would actually abandon me. I assumed we'd just squabble and get over it like we always did. But this time it feels like he's done. And the understanding has made me absolutely numb. I'm not sure what to do next. My buddy, who has been wonderful, has graciously allowed me to stay with her. But I can sense I'm overstaying. She hasn't said anything, but I can feel a shift. She's tired of my condition, and I don't blame her. She keeps insinuating that I should figure something out soon, and I'm afraid she'll toss me out because she has her own life to cope with. I can't rely on her forever. So yes, I'm at a loss. I do not know what to do. I am desperate to remedy this. But no matter what I do, Ray won't listen. He won't even consider the possibility of reconciliation. I feel like I'm running out of time, and my life is spinning out of control quicker than I can cope. Please, I ask you. I've struck rock bottom and am just trying to figure out how to get out of it. I've dug myself in. Read it, please. What should I do now? Update. Hey, read it. It's been a long since my last update, and that's because I've been quite busy, just not in a positive way. Since Ray's death, my life has been a complete disaster. After my last post, I had to leave my friend's house. We ended up fighting, and she kept telling me that I was to blame for everything and that I deserved Ray's divorce. I couldn't take it anymore, so I fled. Don't get me wrong. I still appreciate everything she accomplished for me. She offered me a place to stay when I had nowhere else to go. But after that argument, I couldn't stay. It was too much, and I didn't need someone to constantly remind me of my mistakes. I already know that. Now I'm back at my parents' place, where I've spent the majority of my time simply wallowing in my misery. If you understand what I mean, it feels like I'm locked in a continuous loop of regret and misery, which is exhausting. To top it all off, I was issued with divorce papers so rapidly that I'm not sure how it happened. Ray had those papers ready to go, which leads me to believe he had been planning this for quite some time. And now, as I look back, it's clear that he'd been drifting away for some time. I can't help but wonder if the incident at the pub had not occurred. Would he still have given me the divorce papers? Would he have changed his mind if I had done a complete 180 and worked on my attitude? I mean, I've had plenty of time to think about it, and I regret everything. Every time I belittled him or failed to take him seriously. But it's too late, and everything is moving so fast. My entire life feels out of control, and I'm at a loss on what to do. Being at my parents' house is no picnic either. They constantly remind me that I deserve everything that happens to me. It's as if I'm being hit with a fresh wave of judgment. They keep telling me how I brought this on myself, and I'm really weary of hearing it. I know I made mistakes, but it feels like everyone is against me. I can't get a break. It's as if everywhere I turn, I'm faced with judgment and reminders of how terribly I messed up. And while I understand why people say that, let's be honest. I did it to myself. It does not make the situation any easier. I'm trying to figure out how to go forward, but it feels hard because I'm constantly reminded of my mistakes. I don't know what to do now. Ray is going on from this divorce, and I'm stranded here, feeling as if my entire life is collapsing around me. I'm exhausted, frustrated, and simply overwhelmed. Everyone seems to think I deserve this, and although they may be correct, it doesn't change the fact that I'm still trying to figure out what comes next for me. That's where I am right now. Things are still a mess, and I'm attempting to navigate through them. Everything seems to be moving at breakneck speed, and I'm struggling to keep up. If anyone has any meaningful advice rather than just more judgment, I could use it right now. I'm simply trying to find some sense of direction amid all of this craziness. Update. It has been a long time since my last update. If you're new to this blog, you can read my post history to get a sense of what's transpired thus far. Honestly, I stopped updating for a while because I was exhausted. What's the purpose of sharing if everyone hates me? All I've seen in the comments is how I deserve it and how it's all my fault. People are even expressing happiness that Ray is divorcing me. It's been overwhelming, and I didn't want to continue exposing myself to the negativity, but I feel compelled to provide you with a final update as a means to conclude this chapter of my life. So here I am, updating for the final time. First and foremost, I'm still at my parents' place. If you've noticed, it's been months since my last post, and the divorce has been finalized. Everything moved so swiftly. Honestly, it felt like we were just waiting for the ideal time to pull the trigger. The process was quick, and I ended up with nothing. We had only been married for a short period. No children, no debts to split. Everything was his. Nothing was mine. I was able to preserve a few objects of sentimental worth, but in terms of financial stability, I am absolutely broke. Now I'm divorced and in a complete mess. I've fallen into a profound sadness, and I miss my husband more than I ever expected. I regret everything. The weight of my actions is awful, and I'm constantly repeating events in my head, wishing I could go back and change how I treated him. To make matters worse, I have lost almost 90% of my pals. They all took Ray's side, which only adds to my feelings of isolation. I keep thinking about how I could have done better, how I failed him, and how I wish I had not made those jokes or ridiculed him. Ray was not feeble. He was much stronger than I had imagined. It is terrible to admit that I pushed him away. I mentioned that I doubt I'll update again because the comments here can be cruel. Some made me laugh, but the majority reduced me to tears and pushed me to reconsider my circumstances. It's difficult to acknowledge, but perhaps I deserve some of the criticism. So that's where I am. I'm not sure what the future holds for me, but I needed to offer this final update before closing this chapter. Thank you to everyone who gave support along the path, even if it was difficult to hear. I wish it had turned out differently. I never imagined it would come to this. I had no idea how wrong I was doing or how he saw things. And now my hubby has left me. He left because I kept reminding him of his mistakes and my sacrifices. He felt devalued and decided to leave. And that's not the only reason he departed. I ended up cheating on my spouse, whom I had been married to for 10 years, and he found out. Hey, Reddit, I'm Emily, a 34-year-old woman who grew up in a tiny village with my parents and was constantly dreaming of better things and grand trips. My life was pretty average. I mean, until John entered the picture, it was just like any other adolescent girl's usual day. We met in a neighborhood cafe, each grasping for the same book on a shelf. It was a typical meet cute, and John was charming with a smile that could light up any room. He had charisma, and I was immediately pulled to him. Growing up with my parents, I spent a lot of time in the fields outside my house, fantasizing about being an explorer. I always carried a journal with me, sketching objects around and writing down my dreams. My parents were business people who always stressed the value of stability. This occasionally left me torn between staying safe and exploring more. When I wasn't exploring, I was helping at my family's tiny bookstore. It was my safe haven, a place where I could bury myself in reading. One rainy afternoon, John entered the bookstore in search of refuge from the storm. He was drenched, yet his eyes were bright with wonder. When we both reached for the same book, our fingers brushed and we chuckled. That's how our story started. We couldn't deny the affinity we felt from our first meeting. We spent hours discussing a book that we both enjoyed. It felt fantastic to have something in common, particularly our love of literature. Our conversation included everything from the characters to the story's ideas, and time flew by. He then asked for my contact information, which I provided because it seemed appropriate. John and I started texting, and I got to know him better. John was a pretty cool man, just as I expected. His parents had moved to our town in search of a stable home for their family, and our community was about the most stable I knew. He wanted to be a writer, and I wanted to be a journalist. So we always had something to talk about or dispute about. There was never a dull time between us, and I knew I liked John more than friendship. But I couldn't tell him since I knew he wouldn't feel the same way about a lady. He had just met someone from a tiny town. I didn't want to end our friendship if he didn't feel the same way. So I remained silent about my feelings for him. I went to a college near our town so that I wouldn't be too far from home. I liked our town and never wanted to leave. So I chose a college closer to home. I went to college from home every day that John departed for another college. Yet, we stayed in touch and were constantly telling each other about our college experiences. In my second year of college, John admitted his emotions to me and asked me to be his girlfriend, and I was overjoyed and said yes. Both of our families knew we were dating and were delighted for us. We dated throughout college, and when we graduated, John was offered the opportunity to train in another state, 1,000,000 miles away from home. It was a year-long program that provided him with an excellent opportunity to hone his writing skills while also publishing his work. I was extremely upset at the time, and I couldn't take the thought of him leaving, but I knew he had to go. John promised he would return and that I should wait for him. After John left, I decided to return to our hometown. I eventually followed my parents' advice on stability. I didn't want to travel around too much, and my parents were already elderly, so running our business wasn't easy for them. So I basically took over and turned it into a library bookshop, where even students from the college I graduated from stopped by. We spoke virtually every day for the first several months that John was gone, and he was always telling me how difficult it was out there for him and how he had to learn to acclimate to things in a new state. And I kept encouraging him and keeping him up to date on what was going on where I was. John eventually got the hang of things and began making many friends in the program, and he appeared happy when it was a month before his one-year stay at the facility. I was thrilled to have John back, and I even began preparing a welcome-back party for him. But John then told me that he needed to wait another year before he could return since he had another opportunity. I felt so sad and heartbroken. I was upset, but I didn't want to appear to be against his advancement. So I smiled and told him how pleased I was for him. I braced myself to wait for John for another year before he returned. It took John 4 years to return, and in that time he wrote and published 6 best-selling books, which made me very proud of him. Also, for those 4 years, despite the fact that I had suitors, I remained steadfast in my love for John, despite our distance. In fact, a man named Stephen once proposed to me publicly in front of all the students that visited my bookstore, when I refused to give him any attention. He didn't propose marriage, but he did openly say that he wanted to go on a date with me because he loved me. I had to accept his invitation for the date because I didn't know how to say no in public without embarrassing the man. That was one of the drawbacks of not being able to refuse to do something, even if it was inconvenient for me. I simply couldn't say no to folks. And that is one of the reasons why my marriage failed. I went on the date with the man with the sole goal of explaining why I had accepted to the meeting and informing him that I had a lover waiting for me. Stephen taunted me, suggesting that John might be married with a child on his way here, and I was hoping he was waiting as well. I was upset by the words he uttered, not because of how he said them, but because I began to reflect on them. And the worry and doubt began to develop in my head. I became paranoid and started calling randomly, and when he wasn't there to answer the phone, I panicked and began to suspect he was with another woman. I would ask him questions about the women there in a fashionable manner, and because John knew me so well, he would laugh and tease me because he understood why I was asking. That merely added to my doubts, which I couldn't bear. When John released his first book, I was overjoyed, and he emailed me a copy. The book was dedicated to his expectant love, which was me, and I was overjoyed. The book sold the most, so I ordered the first 100 copies. And because students loved the book so much, I had to order another 300, which sold out in a week. I was overjoyed because my boyfriend was getting increasingly successful, and when he launched his second book, I was the first to receive it, specially autographed by John and addressed to his forever love. He repeated the process with the remaining 4 books before returning home. I was surprised by his return home because he had made no mention of it. To me, he had merely hinted that he might come, and I hadn't even wished he would because he had promised me that the previous 3 years. So I expected the same thing to happen that year. But John had astonished me by turning up at my parents' bookshop, which I ran that day. My head had been stuck in a book, as it usually is. It was his 6th book, and I was rereading it for the umpteenth time. My concentration level was at 100. He had arrived and asked who the author of the book I was reading was, and I had raised my head, thinking it was a customer who had stepped in, shocked. Then came the screaming, followed by embraces and kisses all over his face. People had noticed me with him and were taken aback that I was with the well-known author and was kissing him like a starving dog. I was so thrilled that I burst into tears, especially when he offered me a flower after I finished kissing his face. Then he got down on one knee, pulled a box from his other hand that I hadn't noticed earlier, and asked the million-dollar question. I had checked my response before plunging back into his arms. I was overjoyed that I could finally be with the man of my dreams. Everyone had been so happy for us. We had married in our town's local church, which had the largest attendance that day, including many who had not been invited. Some reporters also showed up. I was sure it was to get the photo for their paper, and indeed, the papers were printed the following day. Mary, a famous writer, is his high school girlfriend. I wasn't particularly delighted when I saw it. They just mentioned me briefly in the paper, and the rest was all praise for John. I shrugged it off. Then he was renowned. I was not so. A few weeks after our wedding, John proposed we move out of town and into an apartment. He'd gone into one of the larger towns. I was astonished and upset, because John had never told me he had purchased an apartment before that day, and I had assumed we would settle in our hometown like our parents had. But I decided it wouldn't be appropriate for his new appearance to be seen living in a nearby town, so I agreed to accompany him. We hired someone to stay at the bookstore, and within 2 weeks, I had effectively uprooted my life from all I had ever known. The first 3 months had been fantastic, since John knew I hadn't been comfortable with the move. So he made an effort to help me settle in by simply being present. He would take me to upscale restaurants, buy me gifts, and we would go on dates to famous landmarks plotted by Google and take tours of them. Soon enough, I began to gradually adjust to the surroundings. Until we know. Sorry, I meant John had been asked to a function, and I had accompanied him. It was the first formal gathering he had been asked to since returning from the States. So I had been nervous and wanted to impress everyone, as his wife. I had the most difficult time selecting a dress because I had never had to worry about such things before. The only parties I'd ever felt compelled to attend were those in our town, and I didn't have to worry about what I had to wear because I was typically the one assisting with the party's operation. I eventually chose a dress, since it was dark purple, my favorite color, and fit the party's theme. I wasn't a makeup-savvy girl. I'd just done my hair and put lip gloss. When we arrived to the party, I felt so underdressed in relation to the other women present, and I felt so out of place because everyone wanted to speak with my husband, but not with me. I felt insignificant because I was only the wife. Nobody asked or even recalled my name. In fact, the only person who spoke to me asked what I did, and I told her I operated a bookshop. Her response made me feel really awful. She responded with an "oh," and then walked on to chat with another individual, most likely someone with a significant position. I literally counted down the minutes until we left, and when we arrived home, John had so much to say about the party and the key people he interacted with. He was excited, and I did not share his enthusiasm. But when I protested about what the people had done to me, John dismissed it as nothing and even suggested that I was probably simply feeling that way because I wasn't used to things or people like that. I was so furious that John assumed my reaction to the party was because I had never gone to one. But I kept quiet about it. 3 years into our marriage, we still hadn't gotten pregnant. And I was wondering what was wrong. I wanted to become pregnant. In truth, I was desperate to be pregnant not just because of the town's prejudice, but also because I knew my mother was previously pregnant with me at the same age. And I've always promised myself that because she only had me, I'd give her plenty of grandchildren to play with, at least for a while. Despite this, I like children, and have always imagined carrying mine and how treated they would be with so much affection, just as I was growing up. I got John to accompany me to a fertility clinic, and he reluctantly consented after I had already made 2 visits on my own and been tested and certified to be fine. When he finally decided to come with me and be tested, we discovered that he had a sexually transmitted disease that he had not treated over the years or had probably taken and prescribed medication for, and it had undoubtedly impacted his sperm, preventing us from having children. I was outraged and horrified because it meant John had cheated on me. But John said he never cheated on me, saying it was probably the first girl he had sex with, and it was simply a one-time thing. They didn't even date. He wanted to level up with his pals, but being the only virgin in that clique meant he was the one getting taunted. So he had only had one unprotected sex with the female, and he never tried again until he realized he had a sexually transmitted disease. He had told one of his buddies, who had just given him a drug, and he had taken it. And because he was fine, he didn't bother checking again. The doctor had urged him to start taking suitable drugs, and we had a 50-50 chance of having children in the next 2 years. We tried everything and nothing worked. We couldn't have any children, and I never took advantage of every opportunity to remind John that he was the source of our problems and that I was sacrificing my youth for him rather than having my second baby. I was with him, and I made sure he knew it every chance I had. He once wrote a book that became a best-selling book, and he was called up to receive an award for best-selling author. I was furious, and I informed him that he was going to receive an award and congrats for some silly book while I was there, desperately hoping and praying for a kid. I even told him how fortunate he was that I loved him because I would not be in his home. Still waiting and hoping. The drugs ultimately kicked in, and he was able to get me pregnant. He was so disappointed that he decided not to attend the event and instead slept at a friend's house for the night. When he returned home, I still refused to apologize because I felt like he was punishing me for his faults, because I was the one who was asked by our parents when a baby was coming, and it grieved me to know that a baby would never arrive. I had recommended adoption to John, and he hesitantly consented since I reminded him of why we didn't have children. We digested everything, but the adoption fell through, and I recall crying myself to sleep that night. And when John tried to console me, I pushed his hand away and shouted at him, reminding him yet again that he was the source of the problem. We did. Fortunately, I became pregnant in our 6th year of marriage, which made me very delighted. But my happiness was short-lived because I miscarried in the first month of my pregnancy. I became pregnant 2 months after that and miscarried again. It was revealed that my womb was incapable of carrying a child to full term. I was incredibly miserable. But John was always there for me, comforting me, and not criticizing me for anything. After 2 more years of unsuccessfully carrying a baby, John advised that we look for a surrogate to help us carry our child. And I refused because I wanted to have the experience of carrying my own child in my uterus. I continued to attempt to get pregnant, but each time I miscarried, and soon I quit trying. I was miserable and unhappy, and John did everything he could to make me happy, but I simply wasn't. John eventually decided we should return to our hometown, hoping that seeing our parents and everyone I knew would make me feel better. We relocated to the house we had purchased a few years ago, so that when we visited, we didn't have to stay with our parents and would have somewhere to return to. I was still dissatisfied, and I somehow managed to blame everything on John. I had assumed that if he hadn't contracted a sexually transmitted disease from unprotected intercourse, I would have been pregnant earlier in our marriage, and it wouldn't be now that my body was rejecting a baby. John bore my ugly, dumb nags without saying anything or blaming me. I continued watching over my parents' bookstore, which is when I met George. George had recently relocated to our town, and he was a widowed guy whose wife had died of cancer without leaving him with any children. It was only after her death that he realized she had a previous surgery with problems, and as a result, she was unable to have children. I became close to George because I felt we were in the same circumstances and that he understood me better. George launched a little farming business in our town, and despite the fact that I knew nothing about farming, I would leave the bookshop and go over to his house and ask him questions as if I were interested in farming just to hear him speak. He was simply excellent, and his somewhat odd accent amused me. I thought he was heartbroken, and we were a perfect match because I was also heartbroken, and for the same reason we don't have any children. I was developing feelings for George, and despite knowing how much I loved John, I couldn't stop myself. I wanted to spend more time with George. Of course, my parents and the entire town noticed my growing friendship with George. My parents summoned me to their home and cautioned me not to approach him because, despite the fact that there was nothing between us, the village would believe otherwise. And my hubby would certainly not think so. I rejected their advice and kept seeing George. John begged me to keep away from him or stop going over to his house to see him, and I became defensive, telling him that we were only friends and that if I had any children of my own, I wouldn't be such a jobless friendship seeker. John remained silent after that, and I was happy, unaware that I was delighting in my ignorance. I would occasionally stay with George at his house, where we would talk into the evenings, and I would even prepare his dinner. I would occasionally bring him breakfast and lunch when I cooked at home. My feelings for George got stronger over time, and I began to have sexual nightmares about him. I would go to his farm early in the morning since I knew that was when he worked, and I would observe him from a distance when he worked shirtless. I even stopped having sex with John, because I didn't think he was man enough to make me pregnant. So what was the point? I knew George was just interested in me as a friend, and he was aware of my marital status. But this made me even more determined to have him look at me as a woman. I started wondering what it would be like to spend the night in George's arms rather than John's, which would usually keep me awake and sexually stimulated. I knew I was in trouble with the way I was acting, and I tried to avoid George, but I couldn't stop myself. So I believed, despite how ridiculous I seem now, that if I could get George into a one-time affair with me, I might be able to get him out of my system and focus on my marriage. I realize how silly I am today for having such thoughts, but I honestly thought I was in love with George, which I wasn't. I was infatuated and thought it was love. So I eventually had my chance. I had fixed George a supper as usual and then enticed him into bed. George expressed regret after the incident, but I told him that it was nothing. And since it wouldn't happen again, he didn't have to worry. Well, it happened again and again. I continued to sleep with George. Then I realized that I wasn't in love with him, but rather that I was doing everything out of desire. John, on the other hand, never acted suspiciously once because I knew he didn't know any of my college pals physically. He only knew them because I mentioned their names throughout our discussions. I told him that Mara, a college buddy with whom I frequently spoke, had given birth, and that I wanted to visit her and her new baby. Mara was in another state entirely, and we had previously lost communication, so I had no idea if she was married or had children, as we hadn't spoken since we left college. My husband, however, was obviously unaware of this. So I lied, and he believed me when I said I would be gone for 2 days. Meanwhile, I had scheduled a trip with George so that it would not appear strange. I had requested him to go a day before me, and when we finished our little holiday, I'd return to town before him. George had gone a day earlier, as scheduled, so I packed my belongings and went to meet him. We were like 2 birds released from their cages. We had breakfast and lunch at the hotel, and we normally ate dinner outside. After spending many days together, we returned to town with a day's notice to avoid suspicion, and we continued our affair behind my husband's back, without fully considering the ramifications of our conduct. Martha once grabbed my shoulders and told me she knew what I was doing, and that I needed to stop before it was too late. Martha, you see, is the old lady to whom no one in that town has spoken. Even newcomers to town were taught what she had done and why they should avoid her. Martha had been caught cheating on her husband with his brother, and her husband's angry attempt to drive out of town resulted in an accident in which he died instantaneously. When the brother learned what had happened, he fled with all of Martha's and her husband's savings, leaving Martha to endure the repercussions of their actions, and without any money. Nobody spoke to her for over 30 years after that, and I heard she once claimed that she stayed with the people who despised her so much so that she could be reminded of the repercussions of her conduct on a daily basis. So, when she grabbed me, told me I was afraid, and swiftly left, I knew she couldn't tell anyone. Even if she was aware of my involvement with George, no one listened to her. So I rejected her advice and continued on my path to self-destruction. Martha's narrative and the life she led were certainly enough of a lesson for me to learn from, but I had foolishly assumed that it would not happen to me since I was intelligent, not realizing that I was the dumbest person alive. What they say about reaping and sowing is accurate, because no matter how hard you attempt to change the outcome of what you planted, you will always get the same result. Plant. That fateful day, I went to George's house as usual, lying to John that I needed to pick up a book delivery. George had gotten up that morning, believing I had slipped up behind him and hugged him, but he had pulled my hands from his body as if they were needles, which startled me. I asked him what was wrong, and he informed me that our affair had to end, and that he was leaving our town for good because he hadn't expected to remain so long. He admitted that he had not told me the whole truth about his wife. He told me that day that his wife was not deceased, as he had previously stated, and that she had caught him cheating and filed for divorce, costing him half his wealth. She had also acquired the house, so he had come to our town looking for a cheaper place to stay until he could save enough money to rent a better apartment. I was astonished by what he said, and I understood he was using me for both sexual enjoyment and feeding. I was ashamed of myself for being so naive as to be exploited by him, and I had just quietly left his house wondering why I had endangered my marriage for someone who wasn't even worth it. When I returned home, John was there and inquired how the delivery went, to which I replied that it was fine. John then brought out a small envelope for me to look at, and I was wondering what it could be until I saw the contents. It was a divorce document that had already been signed by one side, John, and I was astonished and afraid. So I asked him why he was leaving me. He had calmly told me that he had been keeping the papers for a week, waiting for the right time to give them to me, because I had always reminded him of his mistakes and made him feel less of himself. And I had always told him about all the sacrifices I was making just by being married to him and not divorcing him because he couldn't give me a child, even if he eventually could. My body chose not to carry a kid. I still blamed him and was constantly whining about it. I started pleading with John to forgive me and give me the opportunity to make amends. But the next thing John said solidified what he had stated. I know about your affair. I couldn't even ask him how he found out since I couldn't talk. After saying so, he stood up, gathered his stuff, and went. I mean, completely left. He left town and abandoned me. Gentlemen, please. I understand how dumb this sounds, but I am desperate and cannot afford to lose John. Please, help me keep up to date. Hello, Reddit. Perhaps things would have been different if I had done it for money, but I hadn't. I hadn't even done it because George was as attractive as John was. I hadn't done it because John had cheated on me and it was part of a revenge scheme against him. I hadn't done it to even have the child I so want. Because of this, I insulted my husband. No, I had no valid motive to cheat. And that is what makes me such a stupid person, as I am sure the majority of you agree, as you have expressed several times in the comments. Finally, I cannot declare that I do not deserve such insults, because I am aware that everything that is happening to me now was inevitable. I lost my 10-year marriage over something as transitory as passion. I lost the man I loved so dearly for something as transitory as temporal pleasure. I feel So dumb. I should have listened to Martha and stopped. I should not have started in the first place because the repercussions were right in front of me, and I still chose that over the happiness of remaining married. I not only harmed John with my words and actions, but I also violated our solemn vows on the altar. How stupid can you get past that? John has left town, and everyone knows about the divorce and my romance with George. And now, I'm just like Martha, whom no one wanted to associate with, including my own family. Martha noticed me across the street the other day and glanced at me with hatred before going away. I probably reminded her of her younger self, who was too naive to understand that actions have repercussions. George had also left town, most likely moving on to his next victim, although I wasn't truly a victim. He left me to carry the burden of my crimes, alone. I have no one to talk to. I'm completely alone and miserable. I regret all I did to John. I discovered that even before I started cheating on him with George, I had been cheating for a long time. When I found out he couldn't have children, I was constantly trying to make him feel guilty about our lack of children, making him feel less of a man for a mistake he made before we even started dating. I was continuously trying to tell him how much of a sacrifice it was for me to stay married to him. And later, when it wasn't even his fault, I was able to spin the entire situation to make it appear as if it was. Words cannot explain how bad I feel right now. I found how easy it is for tears to flow. Even as I type this, I deserve it. I had it coming when I attempted to replace a good man with a terrible one. I can't think George could be even half the man John is. I just cannot determine what affected my decision or explain why I did what I did. However, the consequences occur immediately after. I wish I hadn't cheated on John the way I did, or that I hadn't been so idiotic as to constantly badger him about his faults. I wish I had been a more understanding wife to him. I wish I had kept our wedding vows, for better or worse. But life does not allow for do-overs, so I'm trapped alone, wishing I could. But I know I can't. I lost the ideal man for me. The only person who could tolerate all of my silliness and still love me. All those years of marriage, and I pushed him so hard that he finally had to leave. I know that if I were in John's shoes, I would have left as well, and I would never have lasted as long as he did. When I stroll along the street, I hear loud whispers. Have me running back inside my now empty home without John as quickly as possible. My parents wouldn't even allow me go near their bookstore when they shuttered it and sold it to someone who started a coffee shop. Even the spot I had dubbed my sanctuary, where I could lose myself in stories for hours and forget about my life, had vanished. I'm forced to stare at every piece of furniture in my house all day, which has grown difficult because they all remind me of John, who chose the furniture for the house. John was the best man for me, but I lost him because of my own ignorance and recklessness. It's hard. It's so difficult waking up every day with the same recollections of what you could have had and what you foolishly lost. It's extremely hard. Update. Hello, Reddit. Unfortunately, this is my last post here. Thank you for reading my story. Your nasty comments were more welcome than the silence and chilly treatment I am receiving from everyone around me right now. I know I'll never be able to forgive myself for what I did to John, and I'll always have regrets about what I had and lost. I just wanted to tell you not to make the same mistakes I did. Believe me when I say that. I'd rather be happy and childless in John's arms right now than be the lonely, wretched hag that I am. Thank you for listening to today's stories. If you enjoyed listening, please like and subscribe if you haven't done so already. Also, leave a comment below to share your thoughts on what happened. Take care. Thank you for listening to today's stories. If you enjoyed listening, please like and subscribe if you haven't done so already. Also, leave a comment below to share your thoughts on what happened. Take care.